All right, shalom, shalom. Just gonna turn my screen share on. So before I start, I'm gonna say the Lord's Prayer as is needed because we're gonna get into something deep. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May thy kingdom come, may thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as forgive those who trespass against us, and lead us on the righteous path, and guard us from evil. In your name we pray. Amen. May the Most High be glorified. Any questions, comments, or concerns, definitely let us know. So, first introduction, we need to understand this. So, I made a playlist called Biblical, right? Academic Origins. It's basically looking at the Bible from the beginning and looking at the sequence of events from the start of it to the end of it, and actually displaying it as if it was actually a reality for us. Now, you'll notice one thing without a doubt. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that almost every scholar or anyone who looks into the subject matter of the Jews do look into the time frame between the transitions of Bronze Age and Iron Age as being ideal to the rising up of the Israelites. Now, we already had talked about the beginning stages of Genesis when we're talking about the creation and how those sequence of events. I do believe in a harmonious sequence of events in creation. Once one can say I'm a young earth creationist, I more say I'm a believer, a firm believer on the sequence of creation in the Bible. We also have to know that we had talked a little bit about basically the coming in of Nimrod and Babel and everything. So we talked about that. There's a lot of important events that have to be understood, right? After the flood, right? The bottleneck and all those different things, right? So we're getting to a point where we already got some good ideas where Babel was, where Nimrod was. Now we're at the part of the Bible, Genesis 12. Let me also put that on the screen. This is what we're going to be talking about today. Genesis 12. And we'll just go to one of these right here. And it's going to be a little bit, because we just talked about the parts with Babel and everything that was right above here. But now we're going to be talking about what happened here. In fact, Genesis 11 is what we need to look at, halfway point. So after Babel, right, after all the things of the divisions, and then we see right here, we're going to get right after Babel, right? So that's going to be the last video we had seen. If you see this playlist, you'll see these are the ones we just recently did. And then I just added on some, some videos for that I think is the most academic that we had did so far on subjects of finding the Israelites, because this is actually what we're going to get on today. We're going to find the Moabites, Israelites, Ammonites, Midianites, all the Shemites, different Shemites of the Abrahamic lineages. I'm going to be pointing them out in reality. So this was just a video of certain things like monophylactic splits. This was right here, a little breakdown of who we believe to be the Semitic lines. This one was a breakdown of who we believe to be the Neo-Canaanites or new Canaanites that come in while Abraham's there. This is also a breakdown of two major groups that are usually connected with Israelites, the Habaru and the Hyksos. So we're gonna get right into the time frame of 2000 BC and then continuing on to historical events after that. So first, let's look at what it says in Genesis 11 and 11, right? And Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 100 years. Now, let me also point this out because this is actually kind of important that I make sure I point this out as we are going over this thing. Remember, we was just talking about basically right before Abraham, right? This is going to be our note right here for before Abram and the family trees. So you see right there, this is very important to understand when you think of a Semitic group, right? From Seth, there's going to be obviously a division at the line of Noah, and Noah's going to have some children, right? And what's important about his children, right, to look at here is that they have major family divisions. Shem has a break, and the main family that we want to note on here, as you can see, has a couple different sons from Shem, right? Aram, Lud, Elam, Asher, Arphaxad. From Arphaxad proceeds the line of Eber. Eber has two sons, and these are two major sons. The Jotanites, which has a lot of historical value and very important to know about, And we talk about them going down into Arabia and everything. And since we're going to be speaking of these things, let me just quickly point out that they do go down into Arabia. There's also genetic evidence of them going down into Arabia, but I'm going to quickly read a quick thing. So remember we was talking about this little book right here that talks about the sons of Noah, and it talks about which ones were the Arabs, or what is called the Semitic groups. That's also going to be important because Abraham is called a Hebrew, which is going to be from the Semitic groups. And that's going to be very important. But right here, you can see this term when it talks about Semitic, right, or Semite. This term includes the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hebrews, the Phoenicians, the Arameans, or the ones by Syria, the Abyssinians, that's the corner of Africa, or lower east corner of Africa, the Sabaeans. This is important because this is what the Jotanites became. They're the Sabaeans, or the second. That's another way of calling them. And the Arabs. These are basically Semitic groups. We also had seen earlier that some records had told us that indeed, when we look at some of the evidences of what was going on, a lot of different individuals were going in different areas. So I'll just leave that like that so we can dive into this. So we're going to have to get some ideas of what's going on at Egypt. So this is an interesting picture that one of the brothers has shared. They were basically sharing what was found in Egypt. We'll come back to this picture in a little bit. But first things first, like we were talking about, the divisions, we're going to be looking under this family right here. We're going to be looking under Peleg. So Peleg is going to be the family that we're going to get Abraham coming from. So let's go and dive in a little bit in the story first. So Shem, as we had all those things, was the breakdown of these things. I'm not going to read it. This is just the summary of what we were just breaking down. That is going all the way from Shem, right, Arphaxad, all the way down to Eber, to Peleg, all the way down to basically Nahor, and then Terah. And then after Terah, you're going to see Abraham and his brethren, right? Nahor and Haran. From basically Haran, who is Abraham's brother, he begats Lot. He's going to give birth to Lot. So they're going to be at a certain area. Now, there's a couple of controversies on where is Ur. What Ur is this? Is this Ur, ancient Ur of the area where the Sumerians were? Or is this Ur of an area that straightforward is called Urkesh? It could be either or, right? There's a lot of harmonious bringing from these areas, because right after, basically, let's go down and get the history of what's important about these events. So we're going to first get the history into the coming of these events, because Elam is going to be a major part in the area of Canaan. And the way that he arrives in Canaan is that he first goes through Mesopotamia. So when does he go through Mesopotamia? And why is that important about the invasions in Canaan? Because we're going to start seeing that in the scripture. So right after about 2000, the touch of 2000 BC, we see eventually the Elamites rose in rebellion and overthrew the third Ur dynasty, right? So that's just a dynasty that we was talking about before in the areas of Mesopotamia. It says an event long remembered in the Mesopotamian, right? Basically some of the Omen texts, different texts they had in that area, just to show that real fast. What they're talking about here. So the third dynasty is talking about basically it was taken over by the Elamites, and the Elamites basically took over that area. It's going to be kind of important for the pieces that's going to align together for when Abraham rises up. So I'm not going to go over this. This is just an interesting little summary that talks up basically the fall of to the Elamites. So I'm not going to play. I'm just going to put this little thing here just to kind of show a little summary of that. So this just talks about what happens, right? No need to play that right now. I'm going to go down. So what we were just reading, let me just read you a little bit of what was happening here. There's a writing. Now the way that we also know this without a doubt is that there's basically a lamentation that's written, the lamentation of the destruction of Ur. It's a real writing that was written a long time ago that was basically bewailing the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur and everything. So it was written in like songs and everything. It's kind of interesting when you think about that too, when we start getting some later connections as we go about this. All right, so we know that had fell and Elam had took over that area. Now we're getting to the 19th century BC, And this is where we're going to start seeing Terah and Abram start to basically rise up. So about the mid 19th century BC, power in Elam passed to a new dynasty. Right now, we're going to see that this new dynasty here is going to be a dynasty. I'm just going to point it out that we're going to start getting some very important ties with. So they're going to be in the areas of Babylon. So you can see right here, this certain dynasty here is going to be there into the 19th to about the time that Israel will be in the lands of Egypt, pretty much. And this is basically Elam, basically in the southeast area of Babylonia. So that's going to be very interesting, very important to kind of take note of these switches of families that's happening up there. The reason why, because we're going to be pointing out some names of some kings and some things. So Elam, just to point this out, because we want to also give the academic and scholarly input on these things. Elam is going to be in an area right above Mesopotamia. There's a lot of writing on them, dozens and dozens of writing. I just wanted to show this for examples of types of writing that they have, right? So they have a lot of writing, early writing of Elam being up there for a while in the area by Susa, where the Akkadian Empire was and everything. So you can see there's a lot of different information on that. You can see the stones. There's a lot of different finds on that, right? So we'll talk about real areas. So very important. We already talked about this before. If you haven't seen this video right here, this little video right here, if you haven't seen this one, this is where we went over basically some of the breakdowns of early areas of Abraham. So we're not going to be breaking down like or Kesh. We're going to get right to the movements of Abraham. So we're not going to be talking about breakdowns of where might have been, where Kesh might have been, and things like that. Where did Abraham start off at? But we're going to note that it's going to be a harmonious understanding that he was in Mesopotamia. So that's going to be what's important to understand, is that we're going to know that he was in areas of Mesopotamia, because we looked at a lot of different locations and stuff. So this was one of those ones that's what's the word I'm looking for? Is it goes into a little bit of that. But that's what we have proven. So I'm just saying we've proven Abram first left or Kesh and went to Haran, Upper Syria, right? That's the edge of modern Turkey, right? After the Dur dynasty, right? So this is what we were just looking at, a quick summary of that. After the fall of the Dur dynasty, when Elam took right, to Kesh. So that's important. Elam took to Kesh. So that's very important too. And began to rule the Fertile Crescent. So that's important. Why is this important? Because Elam makes a movement in the biblical text, right? And Elam was originally far away, but then, so this Susa over there, I'm going to point out on this little map. So you can see right here, Susa, Elam was originally over here. So old Elamite kingdom right there. But then they took over these areas over here. And they went and they basically took over these upper areas up there. So that's going to be kind of important to note for those things. And this is going to be, I'm going to be trying to use academic or maps that others use, right? In a sense, basically looking at the patriarchic age. So this is the age of the patriarchs. So it's going to give a good idea of what societies were there. And we have touched on all these societies. We've touched on the Kassites, because in this time frame, the Kassites are also going to be here. You're going to have the Hittites. You're going to have the Mitanni around these areas. They're going to be the connection of the Hurrians. That's going to be kind of important. But the Elamites are going to be taking over these areas. These are going to be important because the Bible talks about all these nations and them coming into these areas. So the Amorites are going to be basically all in these areas. Now, we're going to also make clarity for some of the distinctions of these groups as we go, because we need to find out when Abraham's groups rise up. So here's an interesting little idea. I'm just going to show a little bit of this, because this is just, I'm just going to show this as an idea, just to kind of show this. This is just talk about basically some possible candidates for groups that have connections and everything. And the reason why this is important is because certain, what's the word I'm looking for, synchronisms. So this one I'm going to just skip, because this is more just for the sake of thought. All right. So now we got to talk about the departure. Now that we got that together, any questions, let me know. Amen, family. Any questions at all before we start? We're going to dive in some, as you know, deep topics. And I'm just going to do a quick scan of how long the note is. So we're going to definitely go through this whole note right here. But this is going to be what we got. We got some stuff. It's going to be definitely something that I think is going to have some information. And we're going to be looking at Bronze Age, Iron Age information. It's going to be deep. So you can see what we got here, right there. So a quick scan. All right. All right. All right. So let's take a view of the departure. Now we're going to be right after all that, chapter 12. So now Genesis chapter 12, this is where the Most High says to Abram, get thee out of thy country. So that land that he's in, and from thy kindred. So the family that he's with. So he separated Abraham from his family, from his father's house, into a land that I will show him. So he's going to go into a land that the Most High is going to show him. And there he's going to make him a great nation, right? So that's important. So now we have the first note that Abraham is leaving, and he initially is going to leave by himself, but he takes Lot. So that's going to be important to understand who he takes with him and what happens with the groups that he takes with him, because they become a developed group culture as well. And they're going to be very physical in that land, and they're going to pop up right at exactly at this time frame that we're seeing here, as the biblical narrative is saying. All right, so watch what happens here. So what happens? As he said, right, Lot went with him, right? So Abram departed as the Lord spoke, right? As the Most High has said, and Lot went with him, right? And how old was Abram? So he was 75. Now let's quickly talk about these numbers. I want you to understand this when I say this. When it comes to these numbers in the biblical narrative, you got to know something important about history. The biblical narrative does something in contrast with history. In history, the biblical narrative matches kind of like the tone that's happening in the time of those cultures. It also is a way for like early Israelites that's coming out of Egypt to kind of get acquainted until they get out of the schoolmaster. So they're under a schoolmaster being taught a couple different things till they come out of the ways of the nation. But remember, as we go across this, Israel is a blessed nation, but they make a couple different mistakes, as we all have made. So we're going to go about this historically. But first, we got to understand that these numbers are symbolic. Now, when I say symbolic, that doesn't mean that they don't have any value at all. I'm saying as in the sense to understand that these numbers are in the sense of like completion. What it's saying when he's saying he's 75, this is in a sense of saying like Abraham he's an older man. Like he was an older man is what it's saying. So you got to understand how these things go. And we'll go about it as we go about it. And if let's say someone really believed these years to be 100%. Now, when we start getting to the year 600 BC, that's when the years get pinpoint and detail gets pinpoint. We also know this in history because early history before 800s, 700s, they was exaggerating numbers. And that's something to note. And a lot of that's symbolic. We notice because examples like the Meshach Stele and certain things like that, they would estimate numbers and things like that, or exaggerate numbers to have a symbolic meaning. Things to mean like a completion of the reign of that individual or things like that. Let's kind of dive in as we go. So we'll go about this with an understanding of that concept, that all of a sudden this is going to be the Bronze Age, and we're going to be working our way until they go into the areas of Egypt. So Abraham also took his wife, right, and Lot, his brother's son, as we know, and they went down into the area of Shechem, right, and the plain of Moriah. And notice what it says at here. I'm going to highlight this because this is actually important. It said, and the Canaanite was what? Then in the land. Why is that important? Because we got to note that the Canaanite, actually, a lot of people think like the Canaanite was there, then a group, Israelites come in and replace them, but rather the Canaanites actually replaced another group that was there. So that's important to understand about the Canaanites, because where was Canaan before this? Remember, Canaan was there with Noah when Noah had cursed him, because he said, "Cursed be Noah." So it's very important. So Canaan had to migrate down into the areas of Canaan. And then that area was named after his name. That's why if you look at the area of Canaan, it's very mixed. the descendants of Canaan, right? When I say the descendants of Canaan, the descendants of Ham aren't the only ones in the lands of Canaan, because there was a vast replacement. But then they came back. And we're going to note this when we think about the Phoenicians and then the Sea Peoples and things like that. So at this time, you're going to have the Phoenicians settled there. If you don't know already, that's going to be already described right here in this study of the Canaanites, the transition from Gasulians from the Chalcolithic to the basically Bronze Age Canaanites. That's going to be something that we had talked about before. So we're going to proceed a little forward. So this is going to be important. So where does he go from here to there? He's going to go into Egypt. So we're going to look at a transition from the area of Canaan to Egypt at his time frame. So this is going to be very important. So we know that he goes into Egypt, and then basically the Pharaoh takes Abraham's wife. And basically Abraham is basically protected by God because God sends a plague on the Pharaoh's house, right? Now, what's interesting is there's an interesting symbolic poem that happens at that time frame. Now, what if this poem, now some people relate this poem with the Exodus. Now, it could be, but more likely it might be that this poem is related to a time when Egypt had got hit by a bunch of plagues out of nowhere. Let me tell you what I'm basically talking about. A lot of people probably know this little thing, but a lot of breakdowns of this actually break down that it might not actually be happening during the time of the Exodus, because this is actually going to be a very early writing that had happened early in the time of Egypt. But why is it important? Because it actually speaks of basically, what's the word I'm looking for? Is a limitation of basically destructions that happen to, what's the word I'm looking for? The land of Egypt. And that's going to be kind of important. A lot of people actually relate it with the Exodus. It has events that seem very close to the Exodus. But I want to read you something that's interesting in it. It just says right here, when it just talks about some things, it says in the poem, right? I'm not going to try to pronounce the name, power or something like that. A name typical of the period, they'll say from the 1850 to 1450 BC, right? Complains that the world has been turned upside down. He says the world has been turned upside down. A woman who had not a single box now has furniture. And that's also interesting. A girl who looked at her face in the water now owns a mirror, while the once rich man is now in rags. So it's kind of interesting when you think about some of these things. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up, because I'll let an Egyptologist kind of give a highlight of these things, because this is a really deep one. And I think it needs to be pointed out before we dive in, because this topic is always one to be talked about.
Middle Kingdom wisdom texts have to do with the Exodus. Stay tuned and find out as I answer this question on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we are answering a question that was asked by a viewer. Orthodox of the USA asks, what are your thoughts on how the Ipuwer Papyrus relates to the book of Exodus? Orthodox of the USA, thank you very much for your question. Let's begin by describing the context of the dialogue of Ipuwer versus the context of the Exodus. The dialogue of Ipuwer was preserved in a single 19th dynasty papyrus, Papyrus Leiden 344, but is actually a much older text. Ipuwer comes out of a tradition of wisdom texts that were written in the 12th dynasty, Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Works similar to Ipuwer were produced at that same time as political propaganda during the Middle Kingdom. And they wrote these works to entrench reforms and bolster a kind of utopian thinking established by the apparatus of Middle Kingdom bureaucracy.
All right, so just to make sure to get that understood, so Ipuwer, just to kind of make sure that's quickly understood before we proceed, it's kind of talking about events that are happening in his time destruction events that are happening in this time of Egypt. So it has some very interesting synchronisms with some very interesting stuff. So the reason why I'm showing that, because we're going to start getting into basically first the events that happen before they migrate into Egypt. All right. So there's a battle that happens that's recorded in the Bible. It's called the Battle of, or you could say, they say Shechem or Shedem or something like that. And this battle is actually going to be what I was talking about before, when the Mesopotamians comes down and basically attacks the areas of the Levant. And there's a couple different individuals on who they believe is who, right? They talk about the one that's going to be mentioned. So it's going to be Genesis 14:1. So it's going to be a little further up. So if we was on Genesis 12, we're going to look at some things of that. So they leave, right? This was the one where we talk about them leaving and everything. And they're going to have a couple different things that's going to happen. And we know that Abram also went down to Egypt, right? And a couple different things happened down there, right? And they're going to come out of Egypt. They're going to leave the area of Egypt, right? Going to let the wife go and whatnot. And then as Abram goes down into Egypt, he settles there, gets his wife, and then they end up leaving, right? And when they leave, they go into the areas where Lot gets a place. Now, what's interesting about it is that we notice quickly is that, as it says, there was strife between the herdsman of Abram's cattle and the herdsman of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites dwell in the land. So we got to make sure we note that at that time, the Canaanites and these other ones dwelt in that land. And Lot is going to settle himself in the areas of basically pre-Sodom. So Sodom and Gomorrah is going to come into effect in this time frame. But first, before we even get there, we got to note right over here something that happens during a time frame right before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So remember, Lot's going to settle in his areas. So we got to note this. I'm going to show a little video of that. So I know that's a lot of information real fast. So I got a little video to kind of put that kind of together of what's going to happen.
Genesis.
So this is kind of a little summary of what's going to happen.
14. In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. These kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Sheva Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites, who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. After his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheva, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said,
Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand.
All right. Just gotta make sure you get it. All right, so now I played this so you can get that visual of what's happening there, so you can see how much destruction is happening in these areas. And there's some kings coming down there. So I'm just gonna quickly name some of those kings that are coming down there. So you're gonna have some different ones. So here's one right here. So this is an idea of one of the kings that could be in the book of Genesis. So his name, I'm gonna try to pronounce it, Arioch. Now remember, I was talking about Elam and everything. So this is interesting because this starts to connect different individuals that basically ties some things together. So this is going to be kind of interesting. So we're going to get basically connections of groups that have connections of Elam. So just like how we were talking about before, when Elam took over the upper areas of Mesopotamia. So everything seems very, what's the word I'm looking for? Historically accurate, on point. So this one, I'm not going to go over these ones today because we want to focus on Abraham and his descendants. But I just want to show you that we do have some information on some of the individuals that may have went down into the areas of Babylon. I mean, areas from Babylon, from areas of Mesopotamia to Canaan. So coming to areas of Canaan. So these ones I'm not going to go over too much, but these are going to be some of the names that were mentioned that we were just seeing on there, that was mentioning some of those individuals coming down and everything, that they are real kings, or they are kings that are possibly able to be found. One of them might be a Hittite. He might be one of the Hittites, earlier Hittites, basically early on, possibly, right? That's something that's also important. So it might have been basically Elam, the Hittites, basically Babylon, groups at Babylon came together. So a lot of them came together for blood to pretty much take over that lower Levant. But we're going to leave this part alone for now because we can go a little more into these little areas, but we're gonna leave it alone for now. So this just goes on to some of those individuals and their names and whatnot. So one more piece right here just to show the visual here. So this is just where some of them may have came from, right? Ancient Anatolia for one of those leaders. But we're gonna skip that part because we're not gonna get into that. We're just gonna point out what's happening in Genesis 14:2. So that these made war with Terah, king of Sodom, and those individuals that we were just talking about, that visual that I was showing. So we're gonna skip that because this is what we were just talking about early on, right? It's gonna be in certain areas of what we're talking about, right? So we're going to skip these names. These are just certain individuals and certain locations and everything. These ones we're going to skip because we got some details to get into. So some details to get into. There's just extra information and whatnot, right? So they just got some little locations, some information about those things. But let's get into what the scripture is getting into here. So they come down there. We're going to just point out that king of Elam, he rules down there for like 12, 13 years. So that's when also they rebel in the land of Canaan. And then all of a sudden they start fighting in the areas of Canaan. So remember, this all happened during the time of Abraham. So you're going to have individuals all over the Levant at that time frame. So they're going to be filling that whole area, the Amorites, Amaleks, all those different individuals that's going to be there. And they're going to be going at it. And then that event that I showed you, so these we can skip because we just showed it on that quick little video, that Abraham goes up there and he basically gets his nephew Lot and he brings him back. And basically after that, they basically are going to be settled. Now, also it's important to note something here. Let me highlight something that's also important on here. So remember, Abraham, the Hebrew, is going to be a Hebrew. That's important. But he also has a confederacy with the Amorites. So this is going to be important to note because he's moving with the Amorites. We got to note that the Amorites, there's going to have to be a time frame where the Amorites exists, and that the Amorites are going to be moving in certain areas. So we can see right there, these were confederate with Abram. So they had a confederacy together. They had an agreement, right? Peace agreement or something, right? That's very important. Now, there's a little more to go into to understand what kingdom was it that Abraham went down into, right? What time frame was that possibly? Now, I believe myself that it was around the time of the Middle Kingdom. Now, the reason why is because different evidences, and what's the word I'm looking for? Scholarly consensus says it has to be somewhere around where the Hyksos of Asia starts to come in. The reason is going to be pinpoint for his descendants. So we're going to look at some of those things. So this one I'm going to skip, but this one's interesting because there's some synchronisms for Terah. I was talking about this before, for Abraham's father being at Mari, so at an area of Mesopotamia. So that one is possible, right? That one's something that's possible. But I do want to talk about something that this Egyptologist talks about that I think we need to address. So I think it's important to talk about. So I'm going to point out something right here.
Tribes, Terah, and the ancestors of the Israelites having lived beyond or on the other side of the river. This is also a problem for the of Sumer hypothesis, because of Sumer happens to be on the same side of the Euphrates as Canaan. One does not actually need to cross the river, the great river being either the river Euphrates or the river Tigris, to actually go from Sumer to Canaan. So it's clear that Joshua has a different in mind than the of Sumer. This is where the city of Urkesh is actually a more viable hypothesis.
All right, so I'm not going to go into that one right now, but that one's interesting because it connects some interesting areas where Abram might have came from. Now, the reason why that's important is because we already know let me go over here. When we was looking at some of the deep information of Haran, we actually know that that's where Abraham's family was, in this area over here. So Abraham, if we look at the movements of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they basically make kind of like the same movements back and forth to the same spot. They go into Egypt, they come out, they go up to Haran, right above Syria. So it might be some interesting importance to note that the family of the early Israelites might be somewhere around these areas. So that's going to be kind of important to note when proceeding forward in some things. But I just wanted to show that because that's kind of important to note. But let me also point out one more thing for the pinpoint information that we're going to proceed on, because now we're going to start breaking down these family trees. That's going to start dividing. Because remember, Abraham,
Computer analytics.
The reason why we're kind of speeding through, because Abraham is one person, but he's living around a lot of different cultures, a lot of different groups. If I break down every single group, it'll be a long live. But we got to mention that all these groups are going to be spending their time around Abram. Now we got to put him into now we see how we got these different groups. What we start to do is synchronize history. Because the Bible mentions all these different individual names, we can take that and synchronize history. I think this Egyptologist has an interesting way of putting that into understanding. He uses a method that basically is calculating these genealogies and putting different genealogies of different kingdoms in a synchronized order to show what is the actual pinpoint accuracy of when these things come to pass. So let me just show why it's important to kind of hear what he's saying on this little thing.
Shown that some surprisingly obscure and unremarkable synchronisms were indeed more important than others. Let's take, for example, the chronology between the Hittite Empire and Ugarit. Chronologists in the past have selected the synchronism between Supiluma II and Amorite plus Supiluma I and Nikmadu II as their primary synchronisms for dating the Hittites and Ugarit. But computer analytics has shown that actually the synchronisms between Tudalia IV and Amittamru II and Mursili II with Nikmepa are actually more important. And the reason they are more important is because these synchronisms act as limiters. Now, what is a limiter? A limiter is a synchronism that prevents two kings lists from moving in respect to each other, relative to each other. And you can see in the graphic here how those two synchronisms prevent the movement of the kings list. They actually are more important for establishing the chronology of both the Hittites and the kings of Ugarit than the synchronisms that have been traditionally selected by chronologists who did their work by hand. Now, the importance of limiters to doing a chronology is not just that they lock up these two, but limiters exist across the ancient Near East.
Limiters. Why is that important? Because once you start, the reason why I had to show you these kings, once you realize that all these kings that was spoken of in the book of Genesis are synchronized, they all appear at the same time. So that's perfect. Once you realize that if all these kings are real kings in the area of Mesopotamia during that time frame, that means that this is getting very pinpoint and very serious. That this person, whoever's writing this, knew some very pinpoint history. So they're writing some very, very serious topics, writing on some very, very serious topics. So let's proceed forward into some things. So that's just important, right? So we're going to be basically looking at this very, very scholarly and academically. So now we're going to start getting into some sources. Let's start getting into some things because we got to first get the introduction in, the little history, and we're going to first go into some beginning things. So from Abram to the Exodus. So now there's different perspectives on the Exodus. If there's a late Exodus or early Exodus, right? There's different views on those things. Remember I talked about the Canaanites? The reason why this video is important because it talks about the Gasulians. And if you know, since I clicked this, there's a lot of Neo empires that pop. Since I clicked this, I might as well point it out. Let me point it out on right here. Look at this, so I can point this out. Watch what I point out on this thing. So you can see right here from northern Gasulians to mixed Canaanites. So that's gonna be something that's important. Why am I pointing that out? Let me go back over here. So you can see right here, it talks about the demise of the Chaldees Gasul civilization. So that's the Gasulians and everything. So it talks about the Gasulian empire was destroyed sometime in the Bronze Age. Now, why is that important? Because didn't we talk about a Mesopotamian movement going down into the area of Canaan and basically destroying the area of Canaan for a while? It's kind of interesting that it had another culture there, and all of a sudden, Bronze Age events, we're going to see another culture come there. But that's what we're actually seeing, is that we're seeing some events kind of take off in some of the areas in the transition of basically the Chaldees Gasul to the Bronze Age. So that's important because of those Canaanites that's going to be in those areas. So this actually draws together old information that we went over. But the reason why we want to look at this, because we want to look at these divisions. So remember, Terah makes Abram. We seen his other son, Haran, had Lot. Lot actually is going to give birth to 2 sons that we're going to note in history, and they're going to make a big impact in history. I'm going to point it out. The Moabites from Moab, and from Ben Ami, the Ammonites. So from Ammon. And those are going to be some very important individuals. But also Abraham is going to get with some other women. So he's going to have Sarah, but Sarah also gives her handmaid over, and Abraham has a baby with Hagar, and he has Ishmael. Ishmael's older than Isaac. Then he has Isaac. So Ishmael is older than Isaac. And then Abraham, after Sarah dies, he gets with another woman named Keturah. Keturah has Midianites. So the Midianites, the Ishmaelites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, these are all going to be in the lands of Israel at that time. So remember, there was an invasion that happened in that area, and the Mesopotamians came down there. And then they basically destroyed a lot of individuals down there. That means that we're going to see a replacement happening down there, because Abram is down there and he's starting to make that area his, and his descendants are going to make that area his. So we're going to get an idea of, this is a concept idea of what would happen. So we know Ishmael had 12 descendants. He's going to have different clans that's going to break off. So they're going to have different groups that's going to break off from him. So remember, around Bronze Age, we're going to know that Israelites, Moabites, Ammonites are starting to develop. So they're starting to develop in that area. That's going to be very important. So we also got to note the Midianites as well. They make their different tribes. So they're going to have their different tribes and everything. They're going to settle in different areas. You can see right here on this map right here, you can see Ammon right there. So this is the Dead Sea. We're going to note this because we're going to see them in actual history. So the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. You can see where they are right here. Get a good idea of that, right? The Moabites and the Ammonites kind of spilling in each other's territory and everything. And so that means that Lot's sons are increasing in the areas of Canaan. So we got Abraham. So these years are contested, right? I'll give them like 100 years of their back, just kind of make it understood that we're not going to pinpoint if it's early Exodus or late Exodus. I'm more considering that as a later Exodus because of the details of it, but to each their own. What we're going to do is be providing the details of that. It was surely so that Abraham existed at this time and his descendants existed at this time, right? So then Abraham is going to be in the areas of Canaan. Lot has his family. They develop in Canaan. Isaac is there as well. He gives birth to, he gets with, right, his wife, right? He's going to give with Rebecca. And then what Rebecca gives birth to? Twins, right? She gives birth to twins, Esau and Jacob, in the same womb. We're going to note that Esau and Jacob are going to be born. It's going to be very early on in the Bronze Age. And then what happens is after Isaac is there, this is going to be after Abraham. We're going to note that also at that same time, Midianites exist there and Ishmaelites. So Ishmael's going to be there. Isaac is going to be there. The Midianites are going to be there, right? And the Moabites and the Ammonites are going to be there. So there's going to be a lot of different family that's popping up right after Abraham. So Abraham has a massive family that pops up at this time. Now, can we prove that these lineages were actually there in the Levant? All these different types of sons and everything, right? We get a lot of different breakdowns of different individuals that's going to exist in these areas. And there's a lot of names that we can kind of put together of the ancient area to kind of point out what's their connections here. Now, this one says Hivites are the Canaanites. Now, the Hivites actually have connections to Hurrians. So that's something that's important to know about. But okay, so there's, again, the Chaldees groups that we have found out became the Amorites and everything, and they're also going to become from other groups. So that's going to be important. The Chaldees groups became Amorites and Canaanites. All right, that's going to be very, very important to kind of note as we go over some things. This is just going over some of the actual names of the lands. So this is going to go over some things So this is going to give us actual real names of some land. So I'm just going to put this aside real fast, right? Because this is getting a quick introduction to this thing. So from Abram to the Exodus, this is just a copy of it, what I was just showing, right? What exactly I was just showing and everything. And this is just an article by Dr. A.J.M. Osgood. I'll not probably say his name weird, but this is actually going to be all what I say, what's the word I'm looking for? Taking the biblical narrative and connecting it with the connection of that land real fast and kind of putting it together. And we're going to look at the details. Let's go about it and get an idea of the details there. So first, let me show you this little screenshot I took of this. Right. So we're going to need this when we come back because it's just giving us the family groups, the family ties and everything. So we're going to come back to this. So Bronze Age is when this family starts to multiply and increase in different areas and everything. So that's something to know with these things. All right. So Bronze Age. So as we had went over, right, and they took Lot, Abram's brother. We already went over that with Sodom, right, with all his goods and everything. And we also know, and there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelled in the plain of basically the Amorite, right? And you know that they was Confederate, right? Why am I keep pointing that out? Because it's important to note the movement with these Amorites going into different areas, because something's going to happen in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is called the Hyksos invasion. Now, the Hyksos invasion is actually very important because it's going to play a major key to the development of the changes that happens with the Israelites. I'm going to point out something here real fast, and we're going to kind of talk about that.
Bronze Age, which caused a second wave of Semitic migrants to leave the Levant and find food relief in Egypt. The migration mentioned in Genesis 42:5 involving Joseph and Jacob was in all likelihood part of the second wave of Semitic immigration. These events also coincide with the ascendance of the Hyksos 15th dynasty, circa 1666 to 1538 BCE. The Hyksos were Amorite Semitic rulers that entered Egypt during the first wave of Levantine immigration.
So there it is. So he says the Hyksos were actually Amorites that moved into the areas of Egypt. This is important because what do we know? Abraham has a confederacy with the Amorites. So the Hyksos are moving into the areas of Egypt. Now, could these have been some of the groups that had ties to Abraham and Isaac early on before they died? Could have. They could have been, Abraham could have left and they could have been there like, now what? They like want to invade some countries? Oh, well, why not? It could have happened, right? That's how it was back then. If someone wanted to invade, all they had to do was get a gang together and say, let's go do this thing in agreement. That's all it takes. And then the power behind it, right? So that's very important. After the famine, right, many basically migrated, right? Migrated. Just take it with an extra I there. Many migrated from the Levant to Egypt exactly during the biblical time frame of the rise of Jacob and the Hyksos dynasty. So this is very important to understand when we think about the Hyksos. So now if we actually look at the idea of those Amorite Hyksos, we know that they had a confederacy. Now, that means that not all of them were Canaanites, but it means a portion of them were Canaanites, and a portion of them could have been some early, like maybe even brothers of, let's say, Abram, right? Maybe you might have some, like we had seen, E1B, 1B groups in there. And then we'll see like J groups and other groups like that in those groups. But notice, look at how they look, those Amorites and those Hyksos, those shepherd kings. Now, one of the classic things that we see is that they have this like, kind of like a blackish hair. Sometimes their pigmentation is light, sometimes it's dark. So that's something that's commonly to know if there's a mixed group. So no doubt if it's a mixed group, we'll probably see different tones, but we definitely see some fit tone for that area, no doubt. So we see these shepherd kings actually moving about here. So that's a nice real picture of the Semitic groups in the Levant. So that's important for visual accuracy. So let's get another accurate idea of this. So a procession of Asiatics, right? That's going to be basically going at Beni Hassan in cultures and context. So let's look at that. So you can get some little understanding of what's happening here. So here is a couple ideas of what is some of those Hyksos. So you can see those different tones there. They seem like they always have like blackish hair, but some of them have lighter tone, some of them have darker tone. See what's going on there with those different groups moving about and everything. But they're basically settling in different areas and whatnot, right? They're gonna be settling in a couple different areas. But let's get a good understanding of what's happening here. So that's just gonna be those groups. We're not gonna be going too deep into them, but let's point out some things with them and whatnot. I'm gonna point out this first, because when we're talking about the Exodus, right? Were Hebrews ever slaves in ancient Egypt? Yes. We know that the Hebrews were slaves in ancient Egypt. Now, this is just, I'm gonna jump a little ahead and I'm just gonna point this out that a lot of people know that this is true. You see these pictures that we were just talking about here, right? We just talk about these images, right? A lot of people know these things are so. These are real things, right? Real finds that are found, right? In connection to groups that's gonna be merging together with the Israelites. Notice what I said there. Merging together with the Israelites. Now, why did I say merging? Now, remember, a confederation, that's going to be important to note, right? And everything. It talks about in some papyrus. It says, mentions a wealthy Egyptian lord whose 77 slaves included 48 of the Semitic origin. So 48 Semitic individuals. You can see that some had connections to different, what's the word I'm looking for? Interesting scarabs that had Jacob on it, things like that. Let me make sure this thing is fine, because this thing, the page acting up. Make sure, check the sound real fast. All right, sounds all right. All right, so this is important. So you can see, now we also spoke about this too, that you got to know that the headquarter of Egypt changed, right? At first it was in Thebes. It was deeper in Africa. And then all of a sudden it went to Avaris. So in the Hyksos capital, Avaris is going to be the Hyksos capital. And that's actually what it's going to be talking about here. And notice, remember, the Amorites and the Canaanites are going to be basically moving together into the areas of Egypt. What is that going to do if you're moving with those Amorites and those Canaanites? You're going to probably pick up some of their culture practices. We're going to look at that too when we look at their culture practices, right? So I'm just going to talk about, you can see, obviously, this is something that I'm just going to skip this. So you can see right here, we'll talk about this too. These are going to be very important. It's going to show some individuals making bricks. So they'll be making bricks in one of the temples and everything. But that one's going to be at Thebes. So we're going to note that. That's going to be kind of important. But there's going to be Nubians in this area. But this is where we have to note as we go over physical evidence of slaves working there is likely to have survived. But a letter scroll dating to the time of Ramses II, right? And that's who I believe is the Exodus Pharaoh, Ramses II. It says, describes a close account of brick making, right? Apparently by enslaved prisoners of war in Canaan and Syria, which sounds very much like the biblical account. So you can see what's going on there. So that's very, very important to take a note of, that there's some very interesting synchronisms that's happening in this time frame in the areas of Canaan and the Levant. And then we're going to note some popping up of those groups in some areas. So I'm going to leave it this one right here. I'm going to just close that, because this is just for a highlight for what we're going to start talking about and everything. Let that open up. Amen, amen. Any questions, statements, or anything, you know what to do. So let me first read a highlight from it. Semites and Nubians, point blank. Let's highlight that. Why is that important? Because we need to note these Nubians. This is important and often not noticed when you're thinking about the Israelite culture and the groups, that not many people would believe that Nubians moved in them. We'll point that out also in a genetic study of the Lachish finds. Some Semites and Nubians are shown fetching and mixing mud and water, striking out bricks from molds, leaving them to dry, measuring their amounts under the watchful eye of the Egyptian overseers, each with a rod. So you see what it's saying there? I was telling us what's going on with this right here. I probably should show the little thing that it's talking about here. And yes, this is very recent. This little thing came out. I think it was 2021 when this little thing came out. I was just highlighting some information and whatnot. But you can see what it's talking about, that picture. We're going to look at this. Let's talk about what it's going to be in Thebes and everything. But this means that there could have been Jews or people being enslaved deep in Egypt and outside of Egypt. They can be slaves all over Egypt, wherever they needed work. But a lot of times it was mostly out of ours. So that's going to be very important to note. We can also see right here, so it was under the watchful eye of the Egyptian overseers, even with a rod. The images bear out descriptions in basically Exodus 1 and 11 to 14, Exodus 5 and 1 to 21, right? And those read, they made their lives bitter with hard labor as they worked with clay mortar. See, just like what it said right there about the bricks and the clay and all those things, mixing mud, just exactly like the scripture says, as they worked with clay mortar and bricks in very form of slavery in the field, right? Exodus 1:14, right? So you can see they was in slavery. So what time frame would this be about? Let's use this to kind of get an idea of what we just kind of went through real fast. So basically, we got to the time frame where Abraham was there. His family divided, and you'll see Moabites, Ammonites, Midianites, Ishmaelites, and Edomites that will be settled in the lands of Canaan, while Israel will be in the lands of Egypt. Egypt would be filled with a new culture as Abraham had got there. Later on, they migrate into the areas of Egypt. If you want to know what dynasty around that would be around the 13th dynasty after the 12th dynasty. So around the 13th dynasty, we'll have some Hyksos moving down there. This is important because we're going to point out that Joseph rides a chariot. This is important because Egypt doesn't have a chariot until the Hyksos invasion. This is going to be very important to note. But this is where we're going to see that the Israelites are going to be developing in these areas, right? They're going to be growing and everything. And then about the time of the 19th dynasty, that's when the Exodus happens. So 19th dynasty is going to be the Exodus academically. That's going to be when we're going to get the Exodus and where Israel is going to build certain cities and everything. So it's going to be very, very important. Now, we actually got to note the Hyksos get exposed. They get expelled from the lands of Egypt a little early. So that's going to be very important. That means the Israelites are going to be in this time frame. So around these time frames, they're going to be dwelling in these areas here. So that's going to be important for pointing out that academically wise. We're going to be pointing out these things as we go about it. All right. All right. So let's go about it. So this is going to be something from Torah. Why? Because we got to know that these things, that people know these things, but we're going to get a little into this stuff. But it says right here, the Hyksos, the West Semitic rulers of northern Egypt in the 16th century BC, right? Just talks about some of they might have been basically the pharaohs of that time that when Israelites were there, that's what these were. Now, I'm not going to read off of this because I just used this for this little timeline right here. But this just talk about some things that we're going to break down. All right. But I'm going to point out this because I think this is kind of interesting to note. This paper presents an overview of developments in the social and political landscapes of the region during the periods of transition from the Middle to the Late Bronze Age, addressing how different social groups, right? So we know this is important, what social groups, right? So a suit that they will have local and regional and super regional ties, right? And basically, I'm gonna just jump down to where it talks about this last part right here. The paper begins with a discussion of how communities transformed and thrived with the fall of the Middle Kingdom. So remember, Middle Kingdom fell because the Hyksos got down there and everything. And with the growth of an independent city centered at Avaris. So this is what we're going to note here. All of a sudden, the Hyksos capital fall, and then there's this new place there. Oh, the Hyksos capital. This place falls, and the Hyksos take over it, and there's a new capital there where the Hyksos are reigning at Avaris, right? So the capital falls to the Hyksos. Egypt is taken by the Hyksos, and there's a new center that's growing called Avaris, right? Or today identified with Tel El the Bai, something like that. So that's going to be very important. That's where we're going to note where the Israelites are going to be developing at. So they're going to be developing in the lands of Egypt. So that's going to be kind of important. So it just talks about ties that binds, just talks about those foreign invaders, relations in the second millennium BC. So that's something that we had went over and noted on some of those things. So this just talks about different groups and their ties and whatnot. So this is something that I think is important for going a little more details into the land, to the actual land. But let's go into it ourselves. So it just talks about some movements. I'm just going to point it out of what it says. Most probably, immigrants from Levant seem to have married local women who also did not match the Egyptian population type. This is important because it lets us know, like we had went over, the Hyksos are from somewhere else. They're not exactly Egyptian. There's obviously someone else that's there. And I'm just going to skip a little part of this. It's just talking about what we just talking about, basically, about the Hyksos and everything and their ties and whatnot. But what they did find that was kind of interesting is that we're going to note that when they get there, we're going to note that they are Amorites. Why is this important? Because right here it says, however, collected within the immediate adjoining quarters where obviously the Amorites lived. So in Avaris, the Hyksos are Amorites. And didn't we just verify that Abraham was with the Amorites? So this is important. This is important culture ties. So if we go back up, we remember what was said early on, that Abraham was obviously in lands where there was other nations there, Canaanites and other ites in different areas. But it just so happens that exactly soon as Abraham gets there, there's an immediate invasion of a group of Amorites that basically take over the area, as we see right here, the Amorite. So Abram the Hebrew had a confederacy with the Amorites, right? So that's important. So the Amorites were the Hyksos that moved down into the areas of Egypt. This is great because this is going to tie together not just family ties, but culture ties, because Abraham could have been in a confederacy with the Elamites. He could have been in a confederacy with the Hittites. But no, he was in a confederacy with the Amorites. And they had moved into the area where the Israelites are going to later be dwelling there. Because remember, who is dwelling with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Remember, Abraham's servant goes and get Isaac. And then later on, you get some events happening with Jacob. So you can easily have a lot of these individuals that would have close ties and know their family. Hey, I know your dad. I know these things and all that. And they're like, oh, come dwell among our land, right? We know you, right? We had a confederation with you and everything. So they're dwelling in the same place with the Amorites. So This is obviously where the Amorites lived. So very important. It says, besides Egyptians and people from Western Asia, right? From basically certain periods of migration, it says Avaris proves more and more to have been a multi-ethnical town. So it's very diverse. So very mixed town. So very important. So we're going to note that. And what groups do we find there? So we find ceramics there from different parts of Nubia, right? So ceramic remains from parts of Nubia can be taken as evidence of also basically Nubians there, right? So Nubians live there. As their pottery has open forms, right? Just certain things that they know is their pottery, right? And it says right here, obviously from their cooking pots, right? It says, as imported, it is likely that Nubians lived in Avaris. So groups of Nubians lived in Avaris over a long period, right? So it just talks about those things. So it just says this would speak indeed for the physical presence of Nubians. So that's what this is saying, is letting you know that Avaris has a lot of different groups, and there's no doubt there are Nubians there at Avaris. So that's going to be kind of important to note here. So this is just a little highlight that I think is important from these professors, doctors, and whatnot, these professionals that's giving some insight on the culture ties. That's important, right? So who are these Nubians? Who are these Nubians? All right, what's going on with these Nubians? Let me point out something that's kind of interesting on this little highlight. So just talk about evidence of culture mixing at basically Tel El Da Ba. Right, is that weird? Avaris, pretty much. So evidence of culture mixing at Avaris. So you can see, indeed, they're going to have different individuals there, right? Since the 12th dynasty to 1540 BC, right? That's very important that we actually note that, indeed, there was some mixed cultures in these areas. So that's going to be very important for noting for moving forward and everything. All right. Point out some more. During the Middle Kingdom, Egyptians often buried their dead in wooden coffins in an extended position. Either basically, I'm just going to skip a little bit of that, just talk about how they buried their groups, even with scarabs and amulets and stuff, wrap their body up, right? Or not. But watch what it says here. So it lets you know the difference between how the Egyptians buried their dead. And then it says, however, at Avaris, elements of a markedly non-Egyptian character appeared in tombs within two. So this is actually very important to understand. In two different levels, they know that there was evidence of non-Egyptian groups at Avaris. So that's important to know. So even presence of donkeys and everything. So obviously those shepherd kings and whatnot. And they also got apparently weapons that had ties to areas of the Syro Philistines, or like the Syrian, like area of the Syrian area, Lebanon. So they got Syro Palestinian weapons buried with them. So they had to have ties from a couple of different areas. So we got Nubians connected there. We got, no doubt, Syrians connected there, or Syrian groups from Syria. As it goes on and tells us a little bit of that right here. It says, for persons, it says of Syro Palestinian descent. So they have some groups from Syro Palestinian descent. It says, for example, it says represents an Egypt's scarab bearing the name, basically the Amu, basically the Asiatics, right? Written in a hieroglyphic script. So they know that in this area where Avaris was, these were not Egyptians. These were a different Asiatic group that are a mixed group that's kind of coming together, is going to merge, and they're going to kind of make an exit, right? We know this because there's different parts of the scripture that's going to give us some interesting things of this, right? So just like we was talking about, right? Syro, Palestinian, and everything, of those Amaru, Asiatics and whatnot. Amaru, Amorite, Amu. No. Go on into that, right? So why is this important? Because the Hyksos are needed to be in Egypt for Joseph to be in Egypt, because the chariot, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. So the chariot in the Egyptian army, when did they get the chariot? Watch what it tells us here about the chariot and everything. It says a little bit of the chariot and everything. They discovered an important thing from the Hyksos, with whom they had numerous wars. So as the Egyptians fought with the Hyksos actually, remember, the Hyksos had connections to the Amorites. And if you don't know, the Amorites have connections to pretty much, what's the word I'm looking for? Let me make sure I point this out. Maybe I got to read this, because someone might not believe it if I say it. But let me point it out, because it's important that I point this out, of the Amorites. So study on the Amorites. Let me make sure I point this out real fast, because I put this in the description, because it's one of those topics that is heavy. This one too. Let me actually point out two things here. I'm gonna point out two things. In ancient Turkestan are related. And all right, this one and this one. All right. Okay. So let me read two things here first. I need to read this one, and I need to read this one. Okay, so first things first, I need to make sure that I look on here. This one I just look because I just need to make sure there's nothing on here. Okay. All right, this is the one I need to read. So this is important to know about the Amorites. Let me make sure I read this first. That's important to know. So the Amorites, what's important about the Amorites is that they are going to be, they're a Indo-European group in their roots. If you go to their deep roots, because they trace to the Hurrians, most likely a mix, and northern countries from basically the Caucasus. And let me make sure I point this out on what I'm saying here. Watch what it says right here. It was on this video, actually. The Amorites in the eastern Nile Delta, right? The identity of Asiatics at Avaris during the early Middle Kingdom. So you see what that is saying? That is letting you know that the Hyksos are Amorites. So that's important. Let me read a highlight from it. From there, I seek to basically requalify the Asiatic presence in the Eastern Delta as comprised of merchant enclaves whose predominant social identity was Amorite. So you see what it's saying there? So it's letting you know that almost everything of them shows that they was Amorite, right? Suggesting thereafter that distinct Amorite groups should be sought within the archaeological record of Tel el-Daba and more broadly throughout Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. So to show you that. So I just wanted to show you that about those Amorite groups, as that's important to know about, as I think that is something that is key for what's going to follow. That's why we had to do that major live on that, to break that down, because we need the Hyksos, but the Israelites, they technically aren't going to be just pure Hyksos, but they're going to be a mix of them with the Nubians and a couple of different groups we're going to talk about. But as we see right here, we can see right here, no doubt that Hyksos were the ones that had those chariots and everything. And it just talks about a little bit of those chariots. But the Hyksos were the ones that had the chariots, right? That's going to be very important, very, very important for the proceeding of Joseph, right? So watch what it says right here, right? The chariot is important to locate the exact time frame transition of when the Hebrews leave the area of Canaan and enter to the area of Egypt. And Pharaoh, why? Genesis 41 and 38. It says, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this? To talk about Joseph, a man in whom the Spirit of God is. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, as much as God has shown you all this, I'm just going to jump down to where we get that part right here. Watch what it says. So Pharaoh's talking to Joseph, and then notice, and he made him to ride on what? He made him ride in the second chariot he had. So he had a chariot. And now it may not sound like a big deal, but if we find a chariot in Egypt, this means this has to happen after the Hyksos invasion, because there's no recording of chariots before the Hyksos invasion. So that means that we have to have Joseph popping up after the Hyksos invasion. That's going to be very important. And so we see that Joseph obviously was there on a chariot. Here's a couple other places. And Joseph made ready his chariot and went to meet with Israel and his father. So he even had his own chariot. And now if you know, having a chariot is like someone having an Escalade today, or like a Phantom. It's like basically you're riding the cream of the crop. You're not just riding a random block of wood put together. You're riding a chariot, which is basically it's like a tank in the ancient times, right? So he's riding a very extravagant chariot to go meet his fathers and everything. And so he also went there with chariots and everything. So they had chariots, multiple chariots and horsemen. So horsemen as well. So they definitely had some interactions with the Hyksos, no doubt, as we see that many of the groups had chariots, 600 chosen chariots in some places, and all chariots of Egypt and captains, every one of them. So you see what's going on there. So we definitely have some contact. In fact, as we can see in Genesis 14 right here, we can see that this will actually have some of those contacts already. So that's going to be very important and whatnot. So you can see that without a doubt that some groups already had chariots in some areas. So you can see what these ones in some other areas, right? When it was smoting the Amorites and other groups around those areas and whatnot, that was pretty crazy. But not this, but Exodus, on the Exodus one right here. So other groups had chariots, whatnot. I don't know why I'm thinking that was a little earlier. More Exodus 14, just to make that clear. Exodus 14, not Genesis 14. So I was going to say, wait, so it's not earlier. So very, very important that the Egyptians, after the Hyksos, they had dumps of chariots. They had lots of chariots, 600 chariots alone in one of these mentioning, and lots of chariots. So chariots are going to play a major part after the Hyksos invasion. So scholars believe that it was the Amorites that became the Hyksos of Egypt that introduced the chariot, most likely from northern nation ties, as there is no doubt it was a mixed multitude. So that's very important. The Amorites are a clan. So this is very important to note. The Amorites are a clan under one name with different dynasties. So there's different dynasties of Amorites. We did a video on the Amorites, and the Amorites have different dynasties, and it's important to know that as well. So there's a couple different groups in the Amorites where they're very multicultural and everything. I'll just show a little example and everything. The Amorites, this is one that I was pointing out earlier. I don't need to go over this now because I was showing this a little earlier. Close that. That's just important information. All right. So now comes what is called the formative period. So formation is going to start happening in this time frame. Let's kind of point out what's going to happen here. At the start of the formative period, it is as if we could see three ethnic supergroups emerging. The Amoritic, right? So the Amoritic groups, whatnot. And we're going to get some other things that's going to pop up. We could obviously see the Arameans, the Canaanites, and the Arabs. So you can see supergroups, three supergroups of those, they say Amorite groups, they'll say. So we're going to note that. The reason why is because we're going to see language pop up. And this is where we also find the evidence of Edom, Moabite, and the Ammonites, because they're Semitic. So this is going to be a Semitic chart that's going to tell us a lot of things about these groups. It's going to give us some pinpoint understanding on Israelites' families that's going to be existing in this time frame, right? So we're getting the Amorites in the area, or the Arameans in the area. That's going to be basically some of the groups in the area of Levant. We're going to get the Canaanites and the Arabs. So very important. These are Semitic groups, right? So very, very important about this that's happening here. So they're going to have obviously some linguistic harmony that they're going to have, because remember, if Abraham had a confederacy with the Amorites, he had to be able to speak to them, and if he was a Hebrew, he had to have some linguistic ties with them, right? So that means they have to have a Semitic tie, right? So there's going to be the formation period. So if you want to know what that is, formation period is between 3,200 and 1,000 BC and everything. So a couple different events are going to be happening in this area. I'm just going to skip this one. This is just for some interesting highlights that I think is kind of important. I'm making sure I watch on this phone if there's any questions or anything. I think my phone just died. Make sure that's plugged up so I can see. All right. All right. So you can see right here, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of these things that's going to tie different groups together. So it's going to tie certain language that we need to understand. So you can see Hebrew right there. So you see that Northwest Semitic. That's important. Northwest Semitic is going to be the family that we need to find the tie of Hebrew and their groups. So they're going to have ties with some languages of early Canaanites and Aramaeans, so Aramaic, in the area of the Syrian language and whatnot. And you're going to have different ties to other nations. So you can see how close these families are tied right here. That's going to be very important. So family language ties, because we're going to look at some things concerning that. All right. Go down a little bit and get into that. All right. Reflecting. This is just, I'm going to skip this one to just talk about the time of the Amorite kingdoms. So that's all that it's talk about is those groups, right? The Amorites or the Amorites, right? Those are going to be basically what we were just talking about, and they're going to have some linguistic ties, right? Let's talk about some of those languages, the Northwest Semitic languages and everything. It says Amorite personal names and words in Akkadian and Egyptian texts from the late 3rd millennium to the mid 2nd millennium BC, and language of the pretty much different language that's going to have ties. Why is this important? Because watch what it says right here. That's kind of important. So just talk about that Northwest Semitic. It says the Northwest Semitic languages attested in full Ugaritic in the 14th century BC. The earliest known samples of Paleo-Hebrew written dates to the 10th century BC. So there's also earlier writings of earlier Paleo-Hebrew, like the the different tablets that were found and everything. But this just gives us an idea of family ties. So groups in areas of Syria have ties to Hebrew, and obviously the Amorites have some linguistic ties with Hebrew as well. So that means that these groups were near each other. So this is going to be the family, Northwest Semitic family. It's going to be important because we're going to start connecting biblical groups together. Linguistic biblical groups are going to start coming together. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the Bronze Age. It says in the Bronze and Iron Age, they were widely found in sites related to local Canaanite and Israelite populations. This is where we're going to start putting these things together, some of these languages and everything, because we're going to be looking at the alphabet. So you see Proto-Hebrew, because we got to find the Hebrews, right? You got to connect Hebrew to start finding the Hebrews. So we got to look at their language. So now we got culture ties. We start connecting linguistics and stuff. We start finding the family. So during a dig at one of the pretty much dynasties, the 12th and 13th dynasty. So that's right before the Hyksos, and again between the 8th and the mid 20th dynasty, right? Just talk about some discoveries that they had found at one of the temples and everything. Basically, what they found was some texts that basically ties some things together. That's going to be kind of important to point out. So Paleo-Hebrew or Proto-Hebrew, Old Hebrew, is going to be your ancient original Hebrew. So you can see this is going to be where you start to get basically the biblical text start to come up and everything. So we're going to have some real texts that are found of ancient Hebrew. So going to have some very important ties to his early family. Let's read a little bit on this right here. So it's going to talk about how they found some things connected to Canaanite and Israelite populations. It says, but also in sites where the Philistine maternal culture was identified. So it's got some connections with some things. Or material culture was identified. Material, rather, maternal material. So you can go a little more into it. It's going to go a little more and talk about the Philistines, because these groups are going to have connection in the biblical narrative. Philistines, all these different groups and everything. But it talks about the Philistines migrating. So Philistines are going to be in the land of Levant before Israel comes out of Egypt. So that's going to be very important. We need to note that they're going to settle in the area of the Levant. So I'm just going to skip a little down from this one. But it's going to be talking about an area of Tel Megiddo, was an important Canaanite city in the late Bronze Age, and an important Israelite, right, administrative center in the Iron Age. So that's important to know that this little area is going to have ties first to Canaanites, and then a culture change, and then Israelites get there. So that's going to be something that's kind of important to know. So it's just giving us basically looking at some of the cooking and things that are going on in the area of the Iron Age Israel. Long story short. But this is going to just give us, what's the word I'm looking for? Evidence that there were Canaanites there, then all of a sudden there were Israelites there. If we know that there was Israelite culture there, and all of a sudden Canaanites vanish, right, before the Israelites got there, then that means there's evidence of a conquest, because we're going to start getting into that evidence. That's very important. So all this is more like a summary before we go like pinpoint details of certain events. So very, very important to note that and whatnot. But that's what we just seen, without a doubt, that was one of those areas that's going to be basically an area that had Canaanites there, Egyptians and stuff, until the Israelites came. Here's another one. This would suggest a major earthquake storm may have occurred in the late Bronze Age, Aegean, and Eastern Mediterranean during the time when the Exodus was happening. Now, why is this important? Why is it important? This is important because the Philistines, right, they're going to be making their movements into the areas of Levant at this time when the Israelites are coming out of Egypt. So this is important. So remember, it's still Bronze Age. We haven't yet spoke of leaving Egypt and everything, because we got to bring out these, we got to introduce the companies that's going on there. So early signs of the works of the Most High. So there's obviously early signs of the works of the Most High and everything. There's no doubt. But first, let me read this so you know why I'm saying that. Why is early signs of the works of the Most High and whatnot. And just to point this out, also what that was right here. Earthquakes, right? At the end of the late Bronze Age and everything. That's just letting you know that was important for movements of peoples and whatnot. But it says, according to written records, the Holy Land has been shaken by 11 devastating earthquakes since 14 BC. At Megiddo, 3 layers of devastation cannot be explained by the invasion of foreign armies. In addition, the excavation of sites far to the north and to the south suggests that additional cities were damaged at the same time at Tel Megiddo. The regional patterns of destruction is consistent with massive earthquakes among the Carmel Fault. So that's important. Let you know that some earthquakes were happening there. Why is that important? Because the land was being shaken up. It was about to change. The land was going to go through a dramatic change. So it's getting it all ready. So just they say that indeed they found those massive earthquakes indeed happening there that played a role to the collapse of the culture. That's important for those that knows why is that important. Right before the Israelites come in, there's this Bronze Age collapse, right? So that's what one thing they're talking about. So that's why it's early signs of the work of the Most High, preparing the water, right? I'll say way. Preparing the way, right? So early signs of the works of the Most High, preparing the way for tent-dwelling Hebrews before the wars of the Philistine sea people in Canaan at the time of the Bronze Age collapse. So very important. Very, very important, because that's going to be a group that the Israelites fight with, the Philistines. The collapse of Bronze Age civilizations 2500 BC remains, because remember, when they come out of the Exodus, they also, when they go up, they turn back, and they got to wait 40 years before they go back into Canaan, right? Before they cross over and start taking over those areas. So earthquakes happen, and then sea people attack, and all types of stuff happen, right? So that's something that's important to know about, right? That's important for culture ties, what groups are going to be there, right? So they know that that's something that really happened. Long story short, that's something that really happened. All right, so you can see in Samuel, right? It says, and both of them, look what it says in Samuel. So you can see where the sea people and the Israelites fight, just to show an example. 1 Samuel 14:11, and both of them discovered themselves in the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they had hid themselves. So he's trying to say that the Hebrews were hiding themselves, but they just got there. And then look what happened. 1 Samuel 14:15. And there was trembling in the host, in the field, and among the people, the garrison, and the spoilers. They also trembled. Why? And the earth quaked. The earthquake, there was still earthquakes going on at that time. So the most high was in the power of the earthquakes. So it was a very great trembling. So that land had earthquakes going on all in that time. Doesn't it make perfect sense that we see evidence of earthquakes, and that as they was fighting, there was some earthquakes that was happening and things like that? Shaking it up over there, right? So culture is making perfect sense for harmony of these things. Now let's start talking about what's happening in the lands of Canaan. What about Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites? Maybe we can see if they exist to get a little more understanding on this. Well, there's some interesting talk. In 1844, the ruins of an ancient city at pretty much in Nubia, they actually have found some interesting things. I'm just going to skip down and talk about one of the things that they have found. They have found basically some connections to what is called the Shasu. And one of them, they found a description of a group as called the Shasu of Yahweh. And this is actually kind of interesting because they found this during the time after the Hyksos invasion, during Amenhotep reign. So this is right before the Exodus. But you're going to get some individuals that are going to be spoken about having Yahweh as their God. And it says, discovery of Amenhotep mention of Shasu of Yahweh placed the god much earlier in history than had been accepted previously, but also suggests that Yahweh was perhaps not native to Canaan. This fit with the theory that Yahweh was a desert god whom the Hebrews adopted in their exodus from Egypt to Canaan. Now, that just means that they have evidence that Yahweh exists. That's all that it means. That when I say Yahweh, the Most High, without a doubt, right? How we want to say it, how we pronounce it, right? You know that the Most High lived. He was there in that time. Now, when I say lived, he was seen on the cultures of that land. So now, what group would have been this first group, this Shasu? Now, if you remember, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they knew the Most High. But if Jacob knew the Most High, Esau also knew the Most High. And what's also interesting, this group might actually have ties to that. But let's look and see what other Egyptians say. The Shasu, also given as Shasu, were a Semitic, so we know they're Semitic, nomadic group described as outlaws or bandits by Egyptians. And in fact, they are named in the column of the temple of Celeb among Egypt's other enemies and appear later in an inscription from the reign of Ramses II. So we know Ramses II also talks about it as among the Pharaoh's enemies at the Battle of Kadesh. So you see that basically he's saying that those Shasu are enemies of Egypt, is what he's saying. So that's something that's important. At the center of, we're going to look at one of the areas that talks about evidence of Yahweh, right? Must stand a pair of related texts from the New Kingdom Egyptian site in northern Sudan, right? Sudan is where the Nubian area was, right? So it's saying where that area where the Nubian groups were. We know Amenhotep had wrote a little bit of those groups, and also Ramses II had wrote about those groups, and they actually mentioned them, and they actually put them on a map. Lists and places peoples that create a map of Egypt's world. Let me just go down and kind of point this out pretty much. What we're basically seeing here is a group that apparently had the name of God with them as they moved around. But what's the word I'm looking for? Were these Israelites? Were these groups actually Israelites? They may have had relations to Israelites. They may have had related ties to Israelites. Here, I'll show you a quick example of what some professionals say.
This reference actually predates both the early and the late view of the Exodus. The year 9 campaign of Amenhotep II records that Amenhotep II took prisoners, among whom were Shasu and Hapiru and Hurrians. Papyrus Anastasi 6 mentions the Shasu of Edom passing the border fortress of Merneptah in order to water their flocks in the Wadi Tumilat. Now, this is very interesting because it records Shasu actually coming into Egypt during the Ramesside period.
All right, so you see, Don, that's kind of interesting because he actually connected that with groups of seer. Now, the Shasu actually would have connections of groups of seer. He actually goes more into it in this, but let's just read a little bit of them. Here's a map of where the Shasu might have been. So another way of saying Shasu is the plunderer or wanderers. So they know that they would have had some ties in these little areas. And if you look at some of the maps of Esau, it looks like it might be an area where Esau was. In fact, they go on and say a little bit of the evidence of those groups and everything. We know that in the Song of the Sea, right, in the Bible, right, in the time of the Exodus, it says the chiefs were ruling in Edom. It says, now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. So Exodus 15:15. There are also sources outside the Bible which confirm this. So it just talks about that papyrus we were just talking about and everything. It talks about Edom, right? That his tribes were basically the Shasu. Might have had no doubt that Seir, many of the groups of Seir might have been indeed the Shasu, right? But this is what it says. It says, we have finished letting the Shasu of Edom, there it says, Shasu of Edom, pass the fortress of Merneptah. That's what he just said. He just told us that indeed Edom was existing at that time. Exactly. Now let's be honest. This is the Edomites. They could have been anywhere in the whole world, but the Bible said that they was right there in the area when Israel left out of Egypt. So they are right there. So it also says Ramses the third also wrote that he says, I destroyed the people of Seir. Well, there it is. Can't mistake that at all. There's no mistake in that. That's three witnesses witnessing of the individuals as Seir, that they're Edomites, and that they're also called the Shasu. So I destroyed the people of Seir among the nomad tribes. I raised their tents, their people, their property, their cattle as well, without number, right? And that's something that this Ramses III, EYB, when they attacked Edom, Seir, carried away in captive and as a tribute of Egypt. So you see what's going on there? That's very, very interesting because we know that that's something that's mentioned broadly. So right here in the Jewish library on Edom, it tells you without a doubt that that's what we're seeing there, a connection that Edom would be in the area of Levant. We have spoke about that too when we talked about some connections of that, right? Here's a little bit more on it, on the Edomites. It's a nice little breakdown of some summary of them.
Word about the Edomites from outside the Bible can be roughly divided into two periods: the periods of the chiefs and the periods of the kings. Transition between these two periods is sometime in the late 9th century, around the time when the kingdom of Israel became divided. Now, these two events aren't related, but the division and weakening of Israel may have allowed for the strengthening of Edom during its period of the king. The period of the chiefs is in the late Bronze Age, with tribally organized nomads in the land south of the Dead Sea. Egyptian records mention a group they called Shasu, a name derived from a word meaning either plunderer or more likely wanderer. The term Shasu is best understood as a social category rather than an ethnonym, or a name for a specific ethnicity or people group. Many ethnicities could be categorized as Shasu, but notably there are 6 groups of Shasu listed in an inscription dated to the reign of Amenhotep III. This inscription includes Shasu of Ser and Yahweh. Now, these names are probably locating where these particular tribes or clans of Shasu originated. Both Seir and Yahweh may both be referencing mountains, possibly sacred mountains. And we can see this in a Amarna letter sent from a king in Jerusalem in the 14th century, which mentions Mount Seir.
Another witness, Amarna letters. So Edom, where was Edom according to history? In the Bronze Age, Edom was right in the area where we see the Bible say that they were. So that's Edom. So we got evidence of Edom, but there's more Shemites that were in that area that we got to note. But let's note what it says right here. Also, the after Exodus, basically interactions with Edom. Notice what it happens in Numbers 20 and 14. And Moses sent messengers to Kadesh, right? Remember we just talked about Kadesh, to the king of Edom. So remember Kadesh, Edom. Thus says your brother Israel. So remember, Israel is a brother of Edom. So Israel didn't come out to fight Edom at first. It says, you know all the travail that has befallen us, right? How our father went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians vexed us and our fathers. And when we cried to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent an angel and has brought us forth out of the land of Egypt. So imagine this, imagine Edom getting all these messages saying, well, we went down to this area of doom and to the most strongest nation of the lands and was made slaves there, and God, our God, freed us from there. And behold, we are in Kadesh, a city in the uttermost of your border. So it's letting them know that Edom circles around Kadesh. Let us pass, I pray you, through your country. We will not pass through the fields or through the vineyards. Neither will we drink the water in the wells. We will go by the king's highway. So that's important. So he's trying to go on the road that the Egyptians have set up throughout the Levant. And he says, we will not turn to the right or to the left, right? To the right hand or left hand until we have passed your border, right? And Edom said to him, you shall not pass by me, lest I come against you with the sword. Now, Edom, that's the problem. That's where it went wrong. That Edom, after hearing all that, he said, nope, we're going to fight. And it'd be your own kind sometimes. It'd be your own kind. But let's go and understand what's going on here. What's going on here? So we're going to actually get a little more into who else is there, because there's other groups that are actually going to be there in that area. But we also got to note something that's interesting here. It says they are not common in Judah and Israel. These earrings, I'm going to point out some earrings that's found in this Iron Age. This is actually interesting because who does Edom mix with? Who does Edom actually mix with? Edom actually mixes with the Ishmaelites, which are actually going to mix with the Midianites. We're going to go over that as we go over these things, because this is going to tie together a couple different groups together. And that's going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of important for this next part here. All right. So I just talked about they found some earrings there. It says, this is what they say, but they do appear to be more common in desert. They say Edomite sites, such as this certain one right here. So they found some earrings that also found archaeological evidence that no doubt that we have a physical Edom, right? Also, the name, the languages of the land. Remember how I was talking about that? Linguistics and things like that for groups that would have ties together and everything. This just talks about the languages of the land. So Hebrew was one of the languages of the land, no doubt. So that's very important. But they also had other languages of the land. So let me point out something real fast on here. that I think is kind of important to point out. Let me close this here. So we would actually have evidence of Hebrew in those lands in Egypt. So look at this. This is actually kind of interesting because when you think of Hebrew, you wonder, where could it have been? Is there any evidence of it being in some of these areas? This is some of the earliest writings. We have some in Egypt and everything. There's no doubt that we have some Hebrew down there and everything and whatnot. So that's something that is important to note. I'm just going to close this because we don't need this right now. That just goes into some languages. We're going to go into something else now. Now we're going to go into the cultures that Edom had mixed with and everything. But first, before I do that, let me give this little mind break right here from here. So let me just say this. Biblical Hebrew is different from modern Hebrew, as ancient Hebrew ties deep on the Semitic calls, pretty much. As I would say, deep in the Semitic, ties. And I'm worried that ties deep in the. Let's to kind of make that make sense. Because I want to give you a little timestamps for how these break down. So right here, you can see it's important to know that modern Hebrew is different than ancient Hebrew. I'll just show you an example. Here's a little idea, right?
And our first super chat comes from Brick Creation for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. I am trying to learn Hebrew for understanding the Bible exegetically. But which Hebrew should I study? I heard there are many. Okay. Now, almost every textbook on Hebrew will only teach you one of two types: modern Hebrew or basically biblical Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew is really Masoretic Hebrew. It's really the Hebrew of the 10th century, 8th to 10th century AD. But we still consider that to be biblical Hebrew because it's used in most of the major biblical Hebrew texts that we have today. So you should study biblical Hebrew if you want to understand the Bible. You will not be able to communicate well in downtown. I mean, if you study biblical Hebrew, you will not be able to order a cheeseburger or ask where the bathroom is.
All right, let that do what it's doing, because that's just a little summary on what is called modern Hebrew versus biblical Hebrew. So biblical Hebrew is going to take us to like the foundation of the actual rising up of the nation of Israel, right? So that's going to be very important. So the ties around Egypt and Canaan tells us the truth about this Hebrew language, that no doubt this Hebrew language had to have some ties with those ancient Semitic groups and everything. There's no doubt. Let me just close that because that one's misbehaving. All right, I got ones right here. All right, so proceed forward. We can get a good understanding on what's happening there and everything. So we already know that Joseph had to be there when the chariots were there. We know that Abraham was there. He was involved with the Amorites. We know when the Israelites come out, they're going to be involved with the Philistines. We know that earthquakes were taking place. We know that a lot of these things are matching with the ancient cultures. We know Edomites were there at that time. And now we're going to note these deeper things of this topic. Now, note what's important about Abraham. It says right here, Abraham 17 and 18. And Abraham said, "Oh God, that Ishmael might live before you." So that's going to be important because Ishmael is going to be dwelling in the land. But this is actually something else. Ishmael, the king of the Arabs. So let's get a little understanding of these things. So Ishmael, the king of the Arabs. So very important to understand, to get a little understanding. So I'm just going to kind of go into this. So this is just introduction. Put this right here. All right. So now this one is just talk. I'm going to skip this one. This is just talk about how the Arabs, remember I was pointing this out earlier, right? We was talking about this a little earlier when I was talking about the Arabs and everything. Make sure these notes open up here. Right. Remember, I was pointing out that the Arabs are Shemites. So that's important. They also go into Abyssinia. So Shemites go into Abyssinia. This is going to be in the Bronze Age time frame. So that's very important to know. And yes, I have been thinking of doing some, just to address that family. I have been thinking of making some short 20-minute Kingdom, right? There's your series remakes. I have been thinking of making some short 20-minute remakes of some videos. So yes, indeed. But I'll never sell information. Just give it out for free. So for the beneficial of everyone else. Because one day, you know, these things will be taught, I feel like, in a classroom or something. All right, so now let's also mention right here. I put soap. Sometimes these notes end up mixing up my things. All right, so I'm going to show something that's important not to forget. So remember, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Something happens before Israel goes into the land of Africa, Egypt. I'm going to point it out. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plains. Now notice that he says all the plain and all the plain and what else? So what did he overthrow? He overthrew those cities, multiple cities, and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the city, which grew on the ground. So this is very important. I'm going to put this like this so we can understand that he destroyed whatever happened. It had to be so obvious that it had to destroy multiple cities. Well, I'm going to show you something now from a place. If you have seen a little bit on this, this has a little interesting idea of some connection. So it's going to be at this place here. And it's going to have some connections to a couple of different places around. They say that this site right here, some biblical scholars argue that this was the site of Sodom and everything. So give or take, right? But I'm going to break it down a little bit that I think is important about this part right here. But check this out. Right in the time of Abraham, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And right before the time of Israel coming out of the land of Egypt, something happened in the land of Levant. Now, it most likely happened to clear a place because the place where it lands is actually where the Israelites come out of the wilderness and they're going to dwell in this area. But something happens right before they come out of the wilderness. And this area meets a devastation unlike any other. So I'm going to really point it out what's happening here. So it's going to just talk about this certain area, this certain valley in Jordan. So something's going to happen in this certain valley here that we're going to talk about real fast. So this is what it says. It's a very interesting event had happened. And you can see right here is a comet. It's going to do some damage. But this is what they say right here. It was 3,700 years ago. So that's 17 BC. So it's like give or take Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, somewhere around there, right? And something had happened in this area right here. Now, what's interesting is some say Sodom is more over here. Some say it might be here. It might be here. But this area is actually where the Israelites are going to come out and they're going to settle around these areas. That's where they're going to settle. So this comet more looks like it's making a way, clearing up that area so that when the Israelites come out, they have a better time to settle in those areas and everything. But a lot of people say it's related with Sodom and Gomorrah. So we're going to kind of talk about a little bit of it. The results showed salt and sulfate levels at 6%. So that's a lot. It increased in the ash layer. So they found, just like the scripture says, when they talk about sulfur and a couple things like that, it says 5% in some layers and everything. And they say the source of these basically had to be the Dead Sea, which borders the middle, that one area we was talking about, Goar. So it's saying that indeed this happened around the area of the Dead Sea and everything. So there's no doubt about this happening and whatnot, and the destruction that's going to happen with these things. But it says, regarding this proposed air burst, an eyewitness description of this. So they also said that there's an eyewitness that's seen these things happen 3,600 years ago. Description of this 3,600 year ago catastrophic event may have been passed down as an oral tradition in that eventually became the written biblical account about the destruction of Sodom. So it's possible, but not likely, because, you know, it might have happened at this time. So this could be like give or take, right? Is this like exact? Is the event exact? Is it exactly to that? Well, not. But it says, it talks a little bit about it. I'm just going to skip a little bit. It just talks about it's a similar air burst that happens around the area where we had ancient Scythians, Natufians, rather. Scythians, Natufians. Ancient Natufians were at this little site here that we talked about 12,000 years ago. That says air burst that happened here seems very similar to another air burst that happened at a site in Mesopotamia. So that's very important. But it does seem like this destruction seems very similar to Sodom, right? Very similar. It seems more like it's preparing this little area. Like all of a sudden some destruction had happened. It's preparing this area. A lot of people vanish here. In fact, it says we present evidence in 1650 BC. It just says there was a burst that destroyed Tel El Haman, Middle Bronze Age city in the southern Jordan Valley of the Dead Sea and everything. So it just goes over and talks about the explosion, had different elements come from it and everything, whatnot. But notice what it says about the air burst. It says the air burst about basically 4 to 5 story palace complex and a massive 4-meter thick mud brick rampart. Basically, it destroyed it. It is C 2000 Celsius. So imagine how hot that is. So 2000 Celsius. So that's quite hot. But it says that what's interesting about this is that what it caused is more important. What it says is important. It says an airburst related influx of salt. So this also may have brought the salt to the Dead Sea. That's something that's also important to know, that the Dead Sea is dead. It might have been affected by this meteor and brought a lot of that salt in that area and whatnot. But it says, is this what it says? It says it caused 300 to 600 long abandonments of 120 regional settlements. So 120, that's a lot of cities. That's a lot of cities. Just like it says, all the inhabitants of the cities were removed. So 120 little areas, right? Regional settlements within a 25 kilometer radius. So, and we know is that there was also a second blast. It says Tel El Haman, that's how you say that, may be the second oldest city town destroyed by a cosmic airburst. So that's rare. Look how rare that is. That there's all of a sudden this airburst happened like this. That's rare. And exactly between the events of what the Bible's saying. So now let's look and make sure we understand what's being said here, because some people think it's only hitting one place. It's not hitting one place. It's actually causing destruction in a radius. So now that also is important, because it caused a lot of places to be destroyed. It caused a lot of different places to be destroyed in its destruction that happened there and everything. So that was something that is important to know a little bit about what's happening in these areas. But it did know that there's some salt that had came out too. So it definitely could have some effects and everything. But isn't Sodom a real city, right? As it says in Luke 10 and 12, but I say to you that it shall be more tolerable in the day of Sodom than for that city. When he's talking about. In Romans, he says, Elias said before, except the Lord of Sabaoth had left to us a seed, we had been as Sodom, and we had been as Gomorrah. And Jude, you can see even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them, the cities about them in like manner, right? So not just Sodom and Gomorrah, other cities were destroyed, giving themselves over to fornication, going into strange flesh, and set forth, for example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Look at this fire, 2000 Celsius. And you can see in Peter, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ash. Maybe let's talk about the ash layers on these things. And condemn them with an overthrow and everything, right? So those example for those who live ungodly, right? But he delivered Lot and everything. So they're talking about a real event and everything. Just like it says, but the same day Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven. Doesn't it sound like something that would rain fire and brimstone from heaven and destroy them all? Here's a little splatter of it. Take a look at this. Look at how it even reaches the explosion. There was an explosion that reached. It may have, who knows how exactly, because remember, we're using instruments later on after the event. So who knows? And I'm gonna also show you that there was a shock wave that killed a lot of people. And I'm gonna show you the example of it. It reached Jericho. It was over here. You can see it's all in the Dead Sea. All that salt would have spread throughout this area, destroying the Dead Sea. That's important. Now, the Dead Sea already has some salt and some things going on with it. But this is something that is important to note on these things. Now, before I proceed, I'm going to show you a little video on what some individuals are saying about this, about the air bursts.
And so finally, that began to come together, and they started writing this paper, and they worked on that paper for probably well over a year. And now it's published. Now, what is it saying? What it's saying is this. I mean, from my perspective, from a biblical perspective, it's saying that the biblical destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain was not a myth, wasn't a legend. It was a real event. It actually happened. That in the blink of an eye, an entire civilization, northeast of the Dead Sea in the southern Jordan Valley, exactly where the Bible tells us it is, was destroyed in the blink of an eye. It was gone. And in fact, the phrase in Genesis 19 is God destroyed it with fire and burning stone, or burning stone and fire. Sometimes the burning stone, a goprit in Hebrew, is translated sulfur.
Yeah.
But it can mean that, but probably in this context means more like what the Akkadian word, similar word, means, which is burning stone. In fact, the Arabic in the Quran actually says burning stones.
The Quran tells the story of Sodom.
Picking that up from the Bible. Yeah. And so, but anyway, so I was translated burning stone and fire from Yahweh out of the heavens. Now, what does that sound like? I mean, to me,
airburst.
What does that sound like?
So it definitely has some importance. It's definitely an event that we can't ignore, right? Whether it has umbilical connections or not, it's definitely a major event that happened in the area of Levant. Here's what they say. There was an air burst. So it was going from the air, it burst. And then all of a sudden it's going to reach the surface, right? A superheated plume of gas, right? Fragments reach the surface. So they end up reaching the surface and everything. And then boom, giant explosion. You can see here's the palace before. Imagine the palace being like this before. So you got some wooden beams there. You got some mud brick, right? The clay roof and everything. So there's a palace before destruction. And then boom. They're saying that this was the palace after the destruction. So the palace after the destruction. They say it was taken down. They say when it was hit, it was completely devastated, completely destroyed. All right, so this is what it says. On an ordinary, this is what happened that day. On an ordinary day, some 3,600 years ago, the inhabitants of an ancient Middle Eastern city, now called Tel El Haman, now identified with the biblical city Sodom, went about their daily business. They had no idea an unseen icy space rock was headed towards them at 3,000 or 38,000 miles per hour, right? Just taking off. It says some seconds later, a massive shock wave smacked into the city. So now here's what's important too, the shock wave that goes on. Moving at about 740 miles per hour, it was more powerful than the worst tornado ever recorded. So what happened there? They had a wind that was more worse than any tornado that ever been on Earth today, right? The deadly winds ripped through the city, demolishing every building. They basically seared off the top 40 feet of the 40-story palace and blew basically pretty much the debris to the next village, whatnot. It said, and this is what they say: none of the 8,000 people or any animals within the city survived. Their bodies were torn apart and their bones were blasted to small fragments, right? Remember I was talking about this, so it's like their bones became small fragments. Small fragments. Then we see something similar like that in Genesis 19 and 26, where it says, but his wife looked back before him and she became a pillar of salt. What if these sayings aren't actually saying like she just looked back, more like she went back, and then that place ended up being destroyed and she got hit with the blast from a distance, right? So, but this all depends if this was actually Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, if it's not, most likely this area is actually the area where Israelites came out and started to settle around this area. Most likely this area was just destroyed so that when the Israelites come out and settle here, right, it would have been prepared for them, because this would have been an area they would have came around. So they want to, at this area, cross the Jordan. So that's very important, almost like preparing them the way, right? Very, very, very deep on that. Very, very deep. But here's an important: the air bursts, according to the paper, may also explain basically the high salt. So remember I was talking about the salt and everything. So you can see the Dead Sea with its salt and everything found in the destruction layer, an average of 4%. We've seen 6 and 5% in some places. In the settlement, as high as 25% in some samples. So you see what's going on with that salt. And this might have destroyed. Remember, the destruction of a lot of these areas is going to be not just because of the blast, but because of the effect. The salt was thrown up due to the high impact pressures, right? So this individual said, of the meteor was likely fragmented upon contact with Earth's atmosphere. It may be that the impact partially hit the Dead Sea. So that's why I'm saying that as the meteor exploded, it could have easily, as the shock waves hit different areas, it could have easily destroyed all types of different cities around there, all types of different areas around there, and caused that need of abandonment that people had to leave that area. So in the Dead Sea, which is rich in salt. So look, the local shores of the Dead Sea are also salt rich. So the impact may have basically redistributed those salt crystals far and wide, right? Not just at Tel El Haman, but also these nearby areas. Nearby Es Sultan, right? Proposed the biblical Jericho that we were just seeing, and also this area Tel Namarin, which was also destroyed. They destroyed, also then destroyed. So you can see all these little areas. That was a massive blast that happened, made all those things reach over there and whatnot. And make sure I also point out this one early on, when I was pointing out earlier. This one just talk about, going a little bit more into that story and everything of Sodom and Gomorrah and what's happening there, and going into the actual evidences of what it left behind and whatnot. So the actual real evidence of it all and everything. I'll click this one to show what's happening on this one. So right here, evidence of a cosmic impact destroyed ancient city in the Jordan Valley. So 2021. And you can see they're talking about that event as it was very important. Very, very important stuff that's happening there. So it just talks about the soil and everything. So it could be responsible for the so-called late Bronze Age gap, the researchers say, right, and everything, because you got to be careful, like the ages here. So give it 100 years off, give it 100 years off, whatnot. So it could be responsible for the Bronze Age gap, the researchers say, in which cities along the lower Jordan Valley were abandoned. So what happened? What did this cause? Cities in the Jordan Valley to be abandoned. So you see what's going on there? Dropping the population from tens of thousands to maybe 100 nomads. Imagine that. Tens of thousands of people, all of a sudden there's only 100 of them. Nothing could grow in these formerly fertile grounds, forcing people to leave the area for centuries. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had to leave during some different famines that had happened in the area, right? So that's very important to understand. Now, this is an interesting one that was just uploaded recently. It was a very interesting one. I highly recommend it if you want to understand if it's a late Exodus or early Exodus. That's why we're not doing that today on this. We're not going to say if it's early Exodus or late Exodus, even though I believe it's a late Exodus. But this is a great video. But I want to show you a piece on here that I thought was very important. That said, right about here-ish.
It tends to produce dates that are with.
Sure. So I know that the low chronology is more popular now, although there have been some radiocarbon studies recently done that maybe suggest it's a little bit higher than the low chronology. I don't have a huge problem with using the low chronology or something close to that if it's really shown definitively, but there's still a lot of argument. However, as we talked about earlier in the 1 Kings 6:1 passage, there's also this variant of the 440th year. If that ended up being correct, then that chronological shift wouldn't really have an effect. We would still be falling into the reign of Amenhotep II. So until there's really some more definitive material on the chronology, I'm leaving that as more of an open question. Others.
Now, the matter of chronology. Radiocarbon in the ancient Near East is a problem. It tends to produce dates that are inconsistent with the historical dates.
All right, so you see why I'm showing you this and letting you know these things, because radiocarbon dating, there's also evidence that there's problems with carbon dating. There's also evidence that there's some minor problems with radiometric dating. So as we go about these years, like I say, right, we're going about it with a scholarly view, but I want you to know that give it a good 100 years on, 100 years off, right, when it comes to these things.
They typically add 150 years for the Middle Bronze Age, 100 years for the Late Bronze Age, and 75 years for the Iron Age. No one knows exactly why this phenomenon happens. It tends to produce dates that are inconsistent with the historical dates. They typically add 150 years for the Middle Bronze Age, 100 years for the Late Bronze Age, and 75 years for the Iron Age. It tends
really.
Okay, if you understood what was happening there, it was talk about the radiometric dating that we were just talking about, that you gotta be careful on that, right? When you go about those things. All right, so let's go a little more into it. So very important. That's why we wanted to show you that thing that happened there. Also the shock wave, right? The shock wave that most likely affected the Dead Sea by its dramatic drop via the heat, right? So very important. So as we know that as that thing hit the Red Sea, it could have affected the Red Sea. The shock wave could have traveled across the Red Sea, and it could have easily destroyed areas of Sodom and Gomorrah, not a doubt. And also the effects of the land, causing famines and whatnot. It says during the early Bronze Age, intermediate Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, the Dead Sea saw significant level fluctuations, reaching in the Middle Bronze Age an elevation of 370 meters below mean sea level. So it's very important to know that it seems that when that happened, the water shrank, right? All of a sudden, that sea, it got hit and it fluctuated. It is some major fluctuations. There's evidence of that area going through some fluctuations that happened in that time. Long story short, just to kind of make it simple. Long story short. But here's a little more to it, to that topic. The reason why that's important because famines happen in that area and certain groups are going to be moving and leaving and everything. So let's talk about what's happening with the evidence of basically Sodom and Gomorrah. So let's talk about there's definitely some evidence of some things that might have happened in the areas of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, it's possible that this valley of Shittim, some say that the Dead Sea was actually smaller before, and all of a sudden, after that happened, after that comment happened, it moved the water, and the water ended up moving into these areas and filling up the valley. So I'll leave that alone for now, but that's something that's to be considered, that it's possible that the Dead Sea had changed at that time, that this was actually a plain here. So you see what I'm doing here? You see what I'm showing you? This was actually apparently Sodom. Sodom might have been also all in the plain. And then when that comet hit, it might have struck the Red Sea, and the Red Sea also went and covered up some of these little areas and grew pretty much and took over a lot of these little areas. So you can see, look how deep. Remember, the Dead Sea is deep, the lowest point of the world. So it's very important. So it might have went into this little plain here and whatnot. Long story short on that, because that's evidence of some dramatic changes that happen. So it's something that is worth mentioning here, something that we got to mention and everything, right? So destruction evidence all over. So now we got that understood. Let's note Terah brings forth again Haran. Haran brings forth Lot. Lot brings forth the Moabites and the Ammonites and everything. We also will get that Abraham would have the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, and the obviously the Israelites and whatnot that would come from the Ishmael. I mean, come from Isaac and whatnot. That's very important. So 12 tribes of Israel are going to come from Isaac. Ishmael also has 12 tribes, but that's different. And then Edom is actually Jacob's brother. So family ties, but they're all popping up at this time frame. So here's a good idea to understand it. You can see these languages. I'm going to point out how these groups are going to be there. So the Moabites. So you can see right here, the Amorites, which will have confederation with Abraham, definitely was there early on. So 2000 BC to 1500 BC, the Amorites were there. And then what happened? Obviously got some ties. They start to switch up with the Proto-Canaanite. And then comes Abraham's children, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and also the Arameans, which will include the groups of the Sabaeans, Aramaic groups. These two groups kind of get some ties together. You're going to have some of the Midianites, and you're going to have some of the Ishmaelites. That's going to kind of make some movements into different areas. But these going to be actual real languages that pop up at that time. And they're popping up Bronze Age, right? They're popping up Bronze Age. So the time frame makes sense. So the Moabite language pops up then at that time. So BC time frame, Moabite language is all up in that area. And its connection to Hebrew. So it's going to have connections to Semitic languages and everything. As you can see, the Northwest Semitic, Canaanite is under that Moabite. So we're going to note some connections with different groups. Because remember, they had some conversations with the Israelites. So Hebrew and Moabite share, obviously, some connections. There's no doubt. So we got to get a little understanding of it. So this is going to let us know of that land, that the lands will have connections to indeed those Semitic families in those areas. So Semitic obviously comes from Shem. So the name Shem. So Semitic has ties to Shem. Another way to say that, Shemitic, Shemites, Semitic, right? There's another way to put those things, whatnot. and it's going to have some ties to these little areas. It's going to be kind of important. It's going to close that. So it's a real important thing to note. But here's where we're going to talk about the connection of the Midianites with the Moabites and more with the connections of the Ishmaelites, how those tie together, and then also more on the Israelites in that area. But notice that these family ties that we're already noting here. So here's a quick introduction of the Midianites and the Ishmaelites, because there's a nice little summary right here of connections of these groups that could be overlooked, I think.
From Courtney Thompson for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. When did the Ishmaelites go extinct? What's different from the Quranic Exodus, from the biblical Exodus? Who is the Quranic pharaoh of their Exodus? Okay. I'm not an Islamic scholar. I actually know relatively little about Islam. Rise of Old Arabic right around that time. That's when we find the earliest traces of the Old Arabic language. So that happens in the 9th, 10th century BC. So anyway, that's the best that I can answer.
This one I'm gonna skip because it's a very small summary, but we'll go into the Midianites and the Ishmaelites because we got enough information to prove them. All right, so remember, who are the Midianites and who are the Ishmaelites? They're going to be the sons of Abraham. Let's prove them. The Midianites traditionally have been identified as Ishmaelites. So that's going to be something important to note, because why would that be so important? Because Abraham is going to be both their father, and they're going to have two different mothers. So Keturah versus Hagar, but still from Abraham, but not Israelites. In part because of an unclear passage in Genesis 37 and 28 that refers to the traders of whom Joseph was sold by his brothers as both Midianites and Ishmaelites. So remember, the brothers, the 12 tribes, had a problem, and they sold. So the 11 brothers sold one of them, Joseph, to the Ishmaelites and the Midianites, and they sold them to Egypt. So in addition, also the story of Gideon, where in Judges, it reveals a part where it identifies the Midianites as Ishmaelites. Right? So a little bit on the Midianites right here. So Midianites would be popping up at that time, because who fights with the Midianites? The Israelites. So they're going to fight also with the Midianites. So they're a culture that has to pop up in the Bronze Age. So that's something that's important. We didn't see them in the Neolithic, so they have to pop up in the Bronze Age. And they also have to be under 2000 BC because they have to be under Abraham, so younger than Abraham, but in the Bronze Age. So that's going to be very important. And you know what we actually find out about the Midianites is some real evidences of their connection. So this one, I just have this for this picture. So this picture right here is going to actually give us some connection to some groups. That's going to be kind of interesting to note. I'm just going to have this picture here for the sake of that. So this picture right here, you can see these little star areas in Arabia. So one right here, another one right here. You got other places in Arabia. Let's point out some things that's going on here. You see this one, Karaya. Watch what it says here. It says the Karaya printed ware, also known as Midianite ware, right? So right there, Midianite ware, which originated in basically one of the areas. It says right here, has been basically dated to the 13th or late 14th and the mid 12th century BC, based on Egyptian finds from Timana site at the certain harbor. So they do know that there's evidence of basically pottery of the Midianites that's going to be moving around these certain areas. So that's going to be kind of important to note about their connections in these areas. So now we see that they're on the map. We got them on the map. So we can put them on a map, a little understanding on that. So it's going to be kind of important to note. So this one's a little more better, but I'll just show a little bit of this. This one just talks about about Esau,
a tribal and clan society,
and Edom, and with Amalek and a couple things like that. I'm going to point out on this because we got to tie Edom, the Ishmaelites, and the Midianites together because they actually merge. Most of them actually merge, especially the Midianites and the Ishmaelites and the Ishmaelites and the Edomites. That'll be the merge direction.
White girl posts Instagram black screen for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. And it's good. White girl posts Instagram black screen for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. And it's good to see you here tonight. Dr. Fox, Dom, what do you think of the view that Yahweh was an Edomite god, Kus, whose followers were also monolatrous and iconic, slaying idols they came across? It's hard to say, honestly. We don't have a lot written from Edom, honestly. Our records from Edom are, well, scarce. We got almost nothing from Edom. So it's going to be one of those things that I think we need more evidence. I'm not sure if I have some reservations whether Yahweh is Kus. Cole Walker for $5.
So this one I'm gonna leave alone. This one just goes a little bit into this idol. Now I'm gonna show you Esau's idol. I have to show you this because it's gonna have some ties. So this idol here, actually, some say it has parallels to the Most High, but obviously not. It's important to know, why does Edom have similarities with the Most High? Because he didn't have a idol. Remember, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't have idols. They worshiped the Most High. But if they picked up idols later, that's because they abandoned the way of the Most High. So Esau must have had abandoned the way of the Most High and start making his own idol. But it's no doubt that he's Esau because his idol has synchronisms to his original God. It says he was the Edomian, basically structure parallel to the Most High. So just talk about this certain idol that they had there and everything. There's other places that talk about these things and whatnot, where we get places where it talks about Bar Kosh, that's talked about in some places of the scripture and whatnot. But this is going to be basically an idol of Edom. The reason why that's important is because watch what it says in some places that we got a note of some things. So Genesis 28:6. When Edom saw Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away, right? He sent him away and whatnot. Notice where did Esau go to? I'm gonna just jump right here. And Esau, seeing that the daughters of Canaan pleased not Isaac, guess what he took? Then went Esau to Ishmael. So Genesis 28:9. Esau went to Ishmael and took the wives which he had, right? So he took some of Ishmael's women. So he got with Ishmael. So that's going to be important for ties to connect Ishmael and his connection. So Jacobel in the land of Esau and the roots of biblical religion. Now, you got to go about this careful, but it just talks about Esau and his connection with Jacob and his land and with his idol. There his idol is. So 13th century BC, during the time of Ramses II, he actually records that one of the individuals of Esau had a idol, right? And they connected the Edomites with this idol, whatnot. So that we not only connect them linguistically, we connect them with their idols, we connect them with their culture as well. And the history is saying that these groups are there at these time frames, at these exact time frames, right? So the book is unfolding before all to witness, yet we must examine the information skillfully. We must examine the information skillfully. So as it goes on, the name Jacobel is to be found in pretty much one of the lists of Ramses II in the 13th dynasty BC. All right, so we just get a little understanding of those things when we just talked about that, the connection to the Edomite idol and everything. Hence, it suggests that, when the name Jacobel, right, settled in Mount Seir or Edom in the 13th century BC and whatnot. But that's just letting us know that right before Israel get there, Edom is exactly where the scriptures say they should be. So we have enough evidence to know that Edom is going to be right there. And what are the odds of such a thing? What's the odds of the Bible to write of an exact individual that's culture starts to basically develop in the Bronze Age, just like the scripture says, right? So Esau, no doubt. All right, so extra thoughts. So this one is just extra information. I'll just show it real fast. This is just extra information. It just has a couple different things. We'll talk about Edom and everything, and a couple different ties that I think is kind of interesting when looking at Obadiah and everything, and some of his interesting ties. This one I'm not gonna go over. It's just I just do it on there. It's a little interesting. All right, let's go down a little bit. All right, so although no name of an Edomite deity is given in the Bible, archaeologists know from inscriptions that the Edomite principal deity was Quash, or how you say it, I don't know how to say his name. Several Edomite places of worship and basically cultic figures have been uncovered. So Edom was filled with idols. One of the most notable is a description of the Edomite goddess wearing a three-horn headdress from the site of Qitmat in Israel. Qitmat. So then that's that thing I was showing you on this little video picture, if I flew by it, of Edom, pretty much. So it's a little picture of the idols that Edom had. That Edom had these type of idols. So there it is, that three-horn one. That was it, pretty much, on his little thing, pretty much. It was a three-horn idol that Edom apparently had. They had an idol going on there. So they know this without doubt. So Edom was over there, and they was next to the Midianites. So we know that the Midianites and the Ishmaelites had ties based on the scriptures. And we know Edom had evidence of being in this place. Now let's keep on digging in it, because it's a little more groups we got to connect. So we got the Moabites, we got the Edomites, the Midianites, some Ishmaelites. Let's look a little more into the Amorites. Watch what it says here. The Ammonites, they also had a deity, prominently had a deity, Malcolm. So it says the deity was the god Malcolm, right? Descriptions of Malcolm has been uncovered throughout archaeological excavations, as have basically just talk about, obviously it represents the Ammonite king and everything. So you can see what's going on there, that we got Ammonites, we got Moabites, we got Edomites. So it says who are the Ammonite, Moabites, and Edomites in the Bible and everything. And it's letting you know that all of them in the Bronze Age, right? They're idols, right? Look at this one standing 6 feet tall. The Ammonite king had an idol standing 6 feet tall. Here's the Ammonites, the Moabites, you got the Edomites, and then the Israelites would have went over across here where that blast had hit, and they would have went over here where Jordan and Jericho would have been linked. So very important to note these things. So Abraham's family, there's a Moabite stone that talks about a real Israelite king, the Moabite stone from the Moabites, written in the Semitic language of the Moabites, with also the evidence of their idol. And they actually are going to write about a real Israelite king on there. Is the Edomite? Here's that Edomite three-horn goddess. There it is, that three-horn goddess they was talking about. So the Edomites had idols. That's something to know, right? Very, very important to know with those things. Is as the Moabites worship the god Kamesh, or how you say that, who may been basically seen on one of the steles, right? Bala Stela, the Bala Stela, how you say that? The most famous Moabite king from archaeological records, at least, is Mesha. So Mesha Stele, that's the one I was talking about, with the description of a real Israelite king. The large inscription he left behind is the largest Moabite text, dating to the 9th century BC. The Meshach Stele describes how King Meshach rescued the Moabites from the Israelite rule. So can you imagine that? The Moabites standing there and literally writing of a nation that came out of Egypt and started to basically oppress the land. And the Moabites in that land have a real stone written about the Israelites coming out in that land. Isn't that something? So now let's talk about the sons of Isaac. Let's get a little detail on the sons of Isaac. Where can we find evidence of them? The sons of Isaac and some of their movements. It says in Genesis 32 and 28, and he said, your name shall be called no more Jacob. So remember, his name was originally Jacob, but Israel. So he received Israel. So Israel was a blessing name given to Jacob because he was going to develop the tribe of Israelites. But Israel, because remember, it said of Abraham, he'd be a father of nations, but Israel. For a prince, as Israel means a prince with L, right? It comes in the breakdown from Sarah. For a prince have you power with God and with men and prevailed. And Jacob asked him and tell me your name and all these things, right? But now he had got the name Israel. So Jacob, Israel, very important. Now they have some interesting things that I think is interesting. Here's a seal, Jacob seal. Now, is it his seal? Is it not his seal? What's interesting is that the name Jacob starts to pop up. That's what's interesting. Now, I don't know if this is exactly Jacob's seal, but it is interesting to know that the name Jacob was in the land near Avaris. So this was actually one of the seals, Jacob, found in the remains of the Middle Bronze Age palace. And isn't that interesting that it's at Avaris where the Hyksos were, and it actually has the biblical name Jacob. So if I was a son of Jacob, I would like to have maybe his name inscribed on my things, right? So we can see that's one of those things that we see there. He also goes on and talks about some other finds that they have there, whatnot, in Avaris. But I think that was interesting because that's a synchronism of a name. That lets us know that his name was around that area. These Hyksos and other Asiatics look highly similar to the style of Joseph and other things like that and whatnot. So you can kind of get a little understanding of him and everything. Here's a 3D rendering of the statue, whatnot. He might have had some puffy hair or something. And you can see he would have had some a colored garment. Now, obviously, many of the different groups could have different colored garments, but that just lets us know of some interesting similarities, right? Statue of high Semitic official found in the shrine of the pyramid tomb in a digital reconstruction. So that's what that is. So they found, this is actually a real statue that they found, and they basically built it up. That's a Semitic person, right? That's a Semitic person, right? Very important. Now we see the area where Ramses was, and then we see Avaris. So we're going to see that Ramses' capital was right next to Avaris. So when Moses went out to speak to the Hebrews and speak to the Egyptian Pharaoh, Ramses could have been over here, and that could have been easily one of those big things that was going on, right? He could have been around that area and everything. Here's just a little more on that thing of Jacob. Is just that inscription, right? That we know that indeed someone with the ties of Jacob, right? I can't say if it was Jacob, directly Jacob, but it was there was definitely some linguistic ties going on there, right? In the right place, in the right times. Now, let me show you an interesting thing about the temple that's there. They got a 12-pillar temple, and I think it's interesting that it has 12 pillars because the 12 tribes, they might have some ties to that, right? Now, I'm not saying it's 100%, but there is 12 pillars in one of these temples that's found in Avaris. That's kind of interesting. And we know that the Israelites and other groups were down there building, so they could have easily did some construction down there. I just thought that was interesting, a set of 12, right? But going on Genesis 40 and 15, for indeed, what does Joseph say? For indeed, I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. So very important to understand that the Hebrews would have spent time in the areas of Egypt. So synchronisms happening down there. Sons of Jacob, Israel, and the Hebrews, and everything. What's going on down there? Here's actually what this actually is. I'm gonna actually show some connections of the language. Hebrew is a Northwest Semitic language, right? Originally written in Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, but later in the square script, right? The later Aramaic changings that happened. Alphabet with the same name, specifically Aramaic. So you can see, here's just some ideas of some places where some of the those languages are. I'll just point out on here, Hebrew. So you can see, just gives us some places where Hebrew would have been at and everything. So some places in Egypt and whatnot where it would have been. So different places where certain languages would have been and everything. So this is just something I put here that's nice to note. Locations where some of these languages will be found at and moving around, because the fact of linguistic connections and everything. So Semitic, right there. All right, so this just goes over like different places where it was found at, and some places in Egypt and everything. Different places. But I'm gonna close this because this just goes over some places where we find what's the word I'm looking for? Hebrew. So this one I was just pointing out, but Hebrew is in the area of Levant and in Egypt. Levant and Egypt. All right, so going a little more into it. As you can see, it's got a little more left here, but we're gonna get through this today. All right. As this is, again, a summary. As we shoot through all these things, we'll get pinpoint on some of these other information, but we want to shoot through this just to show that there is a lot of evidence that indeed the Israelites and their culture connections indeed happened and existed at this time frame. So I'm just going to talk about basically some of the changes that happened in the Levant and everything. This just talks about some things that happened. I'm just going to skip it, but I'll just point this out. It just talks about the collapse and everything. I'm gonna just skip it though. But it says right here, it just talks about a mega drought. Why is that important? Because there are some droughts that happened during that time, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that are going to be important to note and everything. So there's different times, and the time frames for those droughts does match the time frame of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Just to quickly skip through this part. So there was a famine clearly around Abram. So Genesis 12:9, Abram journeyed, going on still to the south, and there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land, right? And whatnot. It says, that's very important to understand, right? They also talk about other famines in different areas. So Elijah had a famine too. So, but that's important to know that there's evidence of famines too. So climate shifts that had happened, that's just something that is important just to note, right? There is clear Bronze Age evidence of an Afro-Semitic Hebrew migration in and out of Egypt in the time frame right before the rise of the Israelite nations. So it's very important. So the city reached the greatest extent during the 15th dynasty, and again during the Ramesside period. At the end of the 20th dynasty, about 1100 BC, the P. Ramses was abandoned. So you can see right there, just like I said, the Israelites will be in Egypt and in Canaan, but just like we see around the 15th dynasty, Israelites will be there. And then all of a sudden, right before the 20th dynasty, they abandoned the area of P. Ramses. So that's evidence of the Exodus. That means that Avaris was emptied out right before the events that we believe are the Exodus, around the time of Ramses. It goes on a little more into it. The archaeological site of Avaris, or also Aris, is located in the eastern Nile Delta in the intermediate, basically area of Tel Dabah, or not. The site can be identified with basically, obviously, the site is Avaris, right? The one we was looking at, but it's definitely the one that was the city of the Hyksos that we just talked about. And the southern part of P. Ramses today is one of those areas where we know Ramses II and his successors were. So you can see what's going on there. And remember, we talk about some things of these areas. So this is very important to note that from the Hyksos to Ramses, you're going to have Israelite involvement. It says, towards the end of the Hyksos period between 16 and 15 BC, it says rulers of Tel El Dabah felt threatened by a possibility of attack. So you can just get a little understanding of that. So this is one we just talk about, Tel El Dabah. We just talk about Avaris, right? You had your Asiatics there, no doubt. They was there for a long time. So that's something that is indeed something to note, right? Just to show where this was coming from. This is just telling us that indeed there were Asiatics in the lands of Egypt, and there was an exodus. It was abandoned. There was an exodus. Massive group left the areas of Avaris. So you can see this basically is giving us some insight on the areas of Avaris. Avaris was surrounded with water back then. So it was island city at that time. It's not surrounded with water now, but it's an island city now. Just to kind of bring it into visual reality, here's some visual ideas of Avaris. All right, so what you're seeing here is Avaris. So now what's interesting about this is that I wanted to find a visual picture so that when we're doing this live and kind of trace back to it, we can kind of get a visual idea of what it might have looked like in that town. What the Israelites would have lived in. You know, think about when you think about the biblical narrative, for now on, when you think about it, think about this piece of land, Avaris. Think about Avaris and how the Israelites felt living in it and being maybe not at the highest point of culture and living like this, you know, and also in slavery. So you can kind of get an idea. They say that there was tombs, is like a place where they bury people. You kind of get an idea of body there. It's mud brick. And then what's important about it is here's going to be the time Israelites come here. So first the Hyksos were there. So after the defeat of the Hyksos, then came the time of the Tutmoses and all those individuals. R1B is up in the land of Egypt, right? You know what I'm talking about? But the Asiatic individuals are still there. There's Israelites still there. They're going to be basically getting involved with others that's in that area, right? So that's going to be very important to note. The chariot is being used now in the time of Egypt after the Hyksos. So they're going to be basically taking advantage of that, of the chariot. And you're going to have different individuals settled in these areas. So they're going to talk about settlements flourished under individuals, no doubt. Look at those sheep and everything, right? They got some mid-tones there, right? So large houses they had large houses there to keep animals. So obviously they were shepherding. The Israelites had houses separate for their animals. So they was probably building over there as well and whatnot. And then boom, this is where the Exodus happens. See that? We'll see what happened there. The city is completely changed. The city is completely changed. I want you to take note of that. That's when the successor after Ramses II, Ramses III comes there after Merneptah. And the city is completely changed. The area of Avaris is now completely changed, is like a military area, right? You got their little armies there. It's no longer a little civil town. That's what happened. That's how we know the Exodus happened, because that area was abandoned and the city was changed to a military area. right? So you can see that right there. So I wanted to show you that for a full historical summary of that, right? So that's what happened there. That's what happened. It's also information on the departure of Avaris and everything, and then the getting of the golden calf and everything. Let's see how we're doing on time. All right. We got a couple little more pieces to hit, and they got some details on it. All right. Go right back to where we was at so we can get deep into these information here. All right. All right, so I want you to see this because I think this is a great summary for the departure from Avaris. So Deuteronomy 29 and 16 to 17. You watch what they say here. This is a beautiful chapter in the scriptures. It says this: you know how we have dwelt in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the nations which you passed by. Right? It says, you have seen their abominations, you've seen their idols. Right? They're idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which were among them. Right? Now, why is this important? It lets us know that they had involvement with idolatry. Those groups were idol worshipers around them. Why is that important? We'll get to the information of the golden calf. Why is that important? But first,
when we consider the act,
I think this is really interesting. This quick conclusion here.
Third, but it is still primarily a Semitic city, with Semitic houses, Semitic pottery. They worshiped Canaanite deities and were buried in Semitic-style tombs. Avaris continued on as a major city all the way through Dynasty 18. And at the beginning of Dynasty 19, Ramses II built his new capital 2 kilometers away from Avaris, which he called Paramses, the House of Ramses. So for a little while, the beginning of the reign of Ramses II, all the way to the mid-19th dynasty, Avaris and Paramses actually coexisted as sister cities. But something very, very strange happens. In that early to middle Dynasty 19, Avaris is completely abandoned. In fact, the whole city is abandoned except for the port, which was called Peru Nefer. The port remained in operation until the end of Dynasty 20, being referenced sometimes as the port of Avaris. After the abandonment of Avaris, the city was still used, but now it became a graveyard. It was used for tombs from the city of Paramses.
All right, so that's very important. So also it's important to know we do want to check those graves, but because of the agriculture, a lot of those graves were destroyed. The way that they were burying them didn't preserve much evidences. But after the Exodus, they end up doing something that's very important. Notice what he said that they were doing in the lands of Avaris. They were doing something very dangerous in the lands of Avaris. And that's why they end up building this calf, this golden calf. Remember, the Israelites had made a golden calf and everything. What does the calf worship have to do with? What does the bull have to do with? It has to do with the Canaanites. But bull worship actually has to do directly with basically Baal. So this is actually very important to understand when you're looking at some of these things and connecting these groups together. Now, the reason why I say that is because there was Baal worshipers at Avaris. All right, so no wonder. So right here, Baal worshipers, Baal ancient deity. It says the worshipers of Baal was popular in Egypt from the later New Kingdom in about 14 BC to its end 10 BC. So that's like Exodus time frame. Some reason Baal was being worshipped when the Israelites were there. Baal was being worshipped in the lands of Egypt. So when the Exodus happened, when Most High said, take the lamb and put the blood on the doorpost, it was because he was calling them out, not because they were righteous, but because he was showing mercy to them, that he was calling them out of the land of the idols and everything. So throughout the influence of the Arameans, right, who borrowed the Babylonian, basically Bel, the god ultimately became the Greek Belos, identified with Zeus. So Bel had connections from Babel. It had connections to the Syrians, Arameans. It had connection to the Greeks with Zeus. So that's very important to understand with that connection there. That Bel just had a problem throughout that whole connection of those areas. So you can see with the Greek Zeus and whatnot, Latin Jupiter, and whatnot, all those connections there. Isn't that something? All right. All right. So that's a reason why Israel probably was doing those odd practices. Now we got to note also how the land, what's some summaries of what just happened to the land. So we already know that we had to understand the Chaldean time frame, understand what happens in the Bronze Age when Abraham gets there, right? The Gasulians and everything became some of the Canaanites. Abraham gets there, and all of a sudden his family starts to develop there. After his family develops there, Israelites go into Egypt and they come out. But you can see this is actually going to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Align with the actual evidence of that land. So a rise and fall in the southern Levant and everything. This one actually tells us who was there during Israel's conquest. So right before Israel conquest. So now I'm going to just talk about real quick Israel coming out of Egypt and who did they take over? What groups did they actually take over and everything? So we got to remember that Israelites will be in Egypt, and there will be another group in Jerusalem that's going to be the Jebusites, right? So the Jebusites are going to be in that area and everything. So they come out, they're going to come out, they're going to enter into Jericho, and they're going to take Ai and everything, and they're going to take a couple different these little areas and whatnot. All right, so that's going to be kind of important to note on this thing. So this is for a map. Here's kingdoms. You can see the crowns as little kingdoms. So you can see Jericho had a kingdom. Ai had a massive kingdom. Jerusalem's right there. So you can see these little coastal areas, right? So Israel, they're going to go through, right, over the Jordan, right to Jericho, right? Remember this spot right here when I was saying, you see the Dead Sea? You see the top of the Dead Sea right here? Right here? Remember I was talking about that the Most High sent that meteor there and kept it abandoned for like 600 years. So you see this meteor right here that hit, that reached all the way to Jericho, right there, right in this area, made this area ready for them, right on the tip of the Dead Sea. Got this area ready. So when Israel came, there was nobody really there. Didn't make it hard for Israel, a shepherd dwelling people, to take over that land. So it makes it very easy to believe that a group with not that much iron and brass end up taking over an area that was high in iron and brass. So that's very, 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 very interesting. Even said they had no smith in Israel. Not a smith in Israel. So that's very important. Let's go a little more deeper into these things. All right, so the Phoenicians start popping up. They come from all types of places. Here's a little idea of some movements of them. So Copper Age and other ages and everything. So they're basically dwelling in these little areas. So they're coming from a bunch of different areas and fall in these areas. For example, while it's not possible to challenge some of the authors suggesting basically connections of certain things, it's going to talk about the area of Dor. It says basically Dor had connections to Aegean and Anatolian connections, pretty much. Long story. The reason why that's important is because the Philistines, the Phoenicians, they have connections to Aegean, right? The Canaanites, they have connections from Europe coming down into the areas of the Levant. Something crazy was happening in Europe. That's why I was showing those earthquakes earlier. Earthquakes were taking off and groups were making movements. So Phoenicians were basically settling those areas, looking for some silver and stuff, money, fancy stuff. So here's something that I think is kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Is kind of interesting, I think. But here's something that happens during the time of Seti, just to show the pinpoint time of when that Exodus happened and the transition of all those things. Is that Seti the first mounting his chariot. So you can see in that time the chariots after the Hyksos and everything. Let me just click this. The reason why is because you can see indeed that chariot there, but it's talking about this is actually a picture of Seti with his chariot, right? That's important to note.
Today it's known as Luxor.
Let me just point something out here. So this one actually talks about Amun. The reason why is because what's the word I'm looking for? I gotta describe this right.
In other words,
Egypt is important to note that Egypt. Remember when I talked about Baal worship and everything? When they had Baal worship going on there, Egypt starts to basically what's the word I'm looking for? They start introducing more and more Baal. I'm just gonna skip this one up here because we don't need it right now. It's just stuff on Seti. I'm just gonna skip this information on Seti. This is when these groups started having them build certain parts of what's the word I'm looking for? Cities in the area of Egypt. Then the Exodus happened around Seti first son, Ramses the second time. So around Ramses the second time when the Exodus happened. Though evidence, if examined correctly, shows that they was slaves for a long time. So it's important to know that they were the Israelites were slaves a long time in Egypt. So they're going to be coming out. But remember, Canaanites are up there and everything. This is something I'm not going to show. This just talk about, the Exodus and everything. This is just a little extra note. These extra things we don't need to go over. It's just leading up to when they settle in the Levant. That's where we're gonna end it, when they settle in the Levant. So very important to know about and whatnot. I'm gonna skip that one because we don't need that right now. But here's just another time schedule. When did the Israelites come into the area of Egypt in the New Kingdom? So in the New Kingdom, that's when they come into the areas of Egypt. So somewhere around here, and in this second intermediate area right here, that's when you're between here and here. You're gonna have the Hyksos invasions happening there, whatnot. So you're gonna have some things happen there. So New Kingdom is where you're gonna have those events mostly happening at in the New Kingdom. Is where you're gonna get Israelites and whatnot to get a good understanding of that. I'll show a piece of this, as I think IP did a great job illustrating this, that the Israelites were a merge of groups that were slaves. Here is a piece of that if you want to see.
From the previous dynasty, especially if they were actively working to erase them from history. In terms of how the Semitic population was treated, it does not appear they were treated well. BTEC notes during the New Kingdom, there is some limited evidence of ritual executions conducted on young males at the site. Also during the New Kingdom, we have evidence slaves were used in the process of brickmaking. A depiction on the tomb of Reichmir shows foreign slaves involved in brickmaking. Later texts during the time of Ramesses II also reference slaves being used in the making of bricks. Additionally, another text reports foreigners, referred to as the Habiru, were dragging stone blocks for the construction of P. Ramesses. So slaves working as brickmakers and helping construct P. Ramesses, as Exodus records, also fits with the archaeological evidence.
So the evidence is stacked. The evidence is stacking up. That just lets us know that there's no doubt this is surely true. Let me just check on this to make sure it isn't something we need to go over. No, we don't. This is just we need to. The reason why, just like when we went over the Hyksos, we got to touch on like some of the major topics that are usually talked about. This one just goes on and talks about some things. I'm not gonna play this one. All right, that's just for a timestamp. All right, let me show something on here too that ties some of that together as well.
Now, interestingly enough, the Bible talks about the conquest of Jericho. That it's after, the Bible even notes that Hatzor had conquered 5 kingdoms, a bunch of kingdoms, and then had, settled into a peaceful role. And they're coming in after Hatzor had made its great expansion. So to have the Amarna letters talk about Hatzor expanding.
Yeah.
We know.
All right, I'm gonna skip this one, but this one's talk about the next thing that we're gonna talk about now, the conquest of Israel. But first thing we need to point out is the real location that, remember, Joshua, right before Joshua put an altar in the lands of pretty much the Levant. So right after Moses, after the events of Exodus and everything, Joshua puts a altar there. So there's evidence of a altar that's placed in the area linking the book of Judges and a couple different things, right? So a Canaanite fort from Judges, right, found in southern Israel. You can see right here. A lot of people talk about this, the Joshua altar, right, in 2020, but it's definitely one of those ones that is definitely true. So looking at it is definitely one of those things that is true and everything. But you can get some good understanding on what's going on with some of these things and everything. Here's another piece. And here it is. So Beetlejuice, late Bronze Age scarab found in school trip in Central Israel. It's got this little scarab and whatnot. And is basically going to show some interesting things of basically ties, group ties, and whatnot. And basically, it is basically tying a lot of nations around together and let you know that indeed there was Egyptians around there and Israelites around that area. So that's something that's very important with this scarab. I'm just gonna skip this one because we got something a little more to go into. But all those tie these little areas together. This one's just probably that summary from that. Yep. All right. Just to point it out. It was pointing out this thing basically, as you can see right here. It was pointing out what's going on here. That's what was found there. So a large fortress dating back to the 12th century BC has been unearthed in Israel. The experts are linking it to the structure described in the biblical book of Judges. So you can see what's going on there. So we're going to point out some things and whatnot. So a lot of things were found. Joshua's altar, a couple of things to Judges, right? Some people with the Exodus trail. I'm not going to go into that right now, right? What was the trail of the Exodus, right? There's a lot of different opinions on that, but we're pointing out the evidence of left behind evidence of Israelites around. Groups that they had involvements with. Groups that they would have had involvements with. So Israel in the era of the Judges, whatnot. Let's just talk about different little connections and everything. And there's a couple different connections. Remember, I'll talk about that place at Joshua. That's where they found the Ebel curse tablet, where Joshua's fort was, right? They're still trying to see if this is a thing, but it has no doubt it got Hebrew letters on it. So whether it's related to Israelites or not, it's definitely found and it's definitely old and everything. So what would the land look like? Here's a nice little summary of how the land would have looked, how it would have developed early on. I'll just show it right here. So boom, Israel would have crossed over, and you can see right here, they would have developed on some of these parts right here. So right on the area where you will see the area of the Jordan, and they would have settled in a lot of these different areas here. And these here. I just put this video here because this is a nice summary of it all. I think this one summarizes it very nicely, but we're going to point it out. So right here, the site that shall not be named.
Moabites, Canaanites, Midianites, Ammonites, or Philistines. The Philistines held a long-time technological advantage over Israel in that they had iron weaponry and chariots. In the north, of the Edomites, Moabites, Canaanites, Midianites, Ammonites, or Philistines.
So remember how we point out all these nations, all the historicity that we found. Midianites right next to the Edomites, Edomites next to the Moabites, and Moabites next to the Ammonites, and then Arameans, Syrians in these areas. All these have been contested by Egypt and the Israelites. So everything that you see on this picture, this is not no pretend picture. This is all historical facts being told from one book. Historical validations that's validated from one book. Let's look at this little find right here. I thought this was kind of interesting. I'm just going to show a quick summary of it.
You shall build an altar there to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not wield an iron tool. However, early Israelite altars were hollow in the center. One of the most important examples of this is the altar that was constructed for the tabernacle, the altar of burnt offering, which was essentially acacia wood on the outside, covered in bronze, and then with a grating across the hollow region to support the burnt offering. So, our understanding of the period of the Israelite conquest. Is this actually the altar that was built by Joshua in Joshua 8, 30 to 31? It's impossible to be certain, but the evidence seems to support this view. Anyway.
So as always, we take these things with a grain of salt, but guess what? Professionals and Egyptologists, scholars all around are saying that the evidence is pointing that the biblical movements from going into Egypt and leaving Egypt and all the structural buildings that they have is showing that indeed these things are true. These things are evident. Let's read a little more. Further south again, these same sea people first attacked the Nile Delta around 1208 during the reign of Merneptah. Now, why is Merneptah important? Because we know that Merneptah identifies groups of sea people, because sea peoples also attacked the Levant. But he makes a major distinction between the Israelites and the sea people. So that's important to understand that the sea people are also invading in the Levant at the same time while the Israelites are invading the Levant. And what's interesting is the Merneptah stele actually contests that the Israelites were a group that basically existed in the time of the sea peoples, while the sea people was living. So that's going to be kind of important. So after the Exodus, the Hebrews traveled around the wilderness for 40 years. It says Joshua, the children of Israel. So Joshua, for the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people that were men of war, which came out of Egypt, were consumed because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land, which the Lord swore to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So you see what's going on there? Joshua was breaking down the true events that's happening here. So let's see one or a few examples of places that Israelites really took down, and the details behind its destruction is actually pinpoint. So until the conquest led by Joshua by the Most High happened in the lower area of the Levant. So here's what it happened in Joshua 5 and 13. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho. So now we got to know what happened at Jericho. That he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man against him with his sword drawn out in his hands. And Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, no, but as captain of the host of the Lord am I come. And Joshua fell on his face on the earth, and he worshiped and said to him, what said my Lord to his servant? And the captain of the Lord host said to Joshua, loosen your shoe from your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. So now what's interesting is that Joshua was by Jericho, and it said it was holy over there. Now, what's also near Jericho? Let's go and look at a real fast picture of that little destruction layer here. You see that little explosion there that had happened right here with Jericho. Now, what's interesting is it's not too far from Jerusalem in those areas. But now that they're on the other side of the Jordan, the Most High said that area is holy, right? So that's going to be very important to note that he calls that land the Holy Land. So he's letting us know about that land where they're standing on the other side of Jordan. So now let's talk about what happens at Jericho here. So this is going to be in Jericho 6 when they went up to the city. So Jericho 6, when they went up to the city. Here's a diagram of Jericho's wall. They actually know without a doubt that there was a brick wall at the lands of Jericho. But just like how it says in the Bibles, apparently the walls collapsed. Now, what's interesting is what happened when the walls collapsed? It collapsed and they went straight up into the city. Well, when this wall collapsed, it made a giant ramp to go right into the city. Well, watch what it says right here in some of the parts. Incredible collapse of the wall as proven by archaeology carried out at Jericho isn't the only interesting biblical parallel found at the site. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, and they burnt the city with fire and all that was therein. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into their treasury. They put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So Joshua 6, 21 and 24. The archaeological evidence at Jericho clearly shows, watch what it shows, utter destruction of the site by fire. Not only is it showing you the wall fell, but it's showing you that the city was destroyed by fire. What was burned is essentially interesting. So it's interesting what was burned, even by details of the Bible. The Bible shows Jericho's destruction occurred during the spring harvest season, as it says in Jericho 5, 10, and 12. Excavations have shown great quantities of harvest grain. Now, why is that important? Because the details of the Bible are pinpoint. If Jericho was taken down in the spring and they had a nice spring harvest, then guess what? We'll find evidence of it. And they did find it. As it says, excavations have shown quantities of harvested grain in large containers at Jericho, burnt to a crisp. So here's where that's coming from right here. So you can see that we are using real finds, real stuff, right? So they talk about Jericho and everything and some of the evidences, right? So they talk about the remarkable evidences and everything. So they were uncovering Jericho 2020 and everything. So they're looking at that major evidence of these cities and whatnot. So you can see right there the city and how the walls fell, collapse of wall revealed by excavations, right? So not only not just the burnt things inside of it, but the wall fell, right? And the layers, right? And it just goes right here and just talks about itself means, just talk about the place having a name, basically meaning sacrificial smoke. Joshua 8 and 20, specifically brings attention to the plume of smoke that arose at I. Now it's going to also connect I. So remember, we talk about Jericho. Now it comes I. Pottery and structure at this site show signs of having been ravaged by fire. This is significant as the only 3 cities, according to Joshua, that were burned in this conquest were Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. So you see what's going on there? To let you know that indeed a lot of these cities, these major cities, even Ai, the other ones are burned. The latest pottery at the site was around 14 BC, roughly the time of Joshua's conquest, give or take. According to the biblical literature, early Exodus conquest date, right? So the chronological, basically the site makes sense in this respect, in the sense of the old late date and everything, but they also have evidence of an early date as well. So that's very important, which we're also going to point out in this. So watch what it says right here. The walls, the destruction of fire, even harvest season. So we know it was even harvest season and everything, parallel with the biblical account and everything. And just like it says in all these little areas, I'm just going to skip this little thing as I'm going to read it. We just basically touched on it mostly, on that destruction. The book of Joshua and the Bible describes in detail the conquest of the Canaanite cities in the invading Israelites, by the invading Israelites. So Joshua obviously talks about the invasions on the Canaanites by the Israelites. Based on this account, one might have expected to find evidence of wholesale destruction at the Canaanite site that was excavated. Just talks about these different sites and everything, whatnot. But it just lets you know that indeed we know those Canaanites, like we know they had connections to the Aegean, right? And we know they were destroyed and everything and whatnot. I'm just gonna skip this part because this one's just talking about in connection to, as you see, right, when they talk about the city, it shall be when you have taken the city, you shall set the city on fire, right? Certain parts where it talks about which cities will burn, certain cities will be taken and set on fire and everything. And they burned their chariots with fire and stuff. It was berserk going on. A lot of burning going on there. So even Hazor, they burned it with fire and everything. So we see a lot of evidence of these things. What it says here, it is still possible that the destruction was caused by the Israelites under Joshua, although it was when the destruction was believed to be dated in 1230 BC. So here's one that's talking about a destruction later in 1230 BC. This one's kind of interesting. One structure in particular, right, area S, was destroyed suddenly and violently. Ash layers and fallen mud brick, right? Fallen mud brick covered the whole structure, and several skeletons of adults, children, and babies were found trapped under the collapsed wall. Other buildings at Lachish, so remember they also take Lachish. Other buildings at Lachish were also destroyed at this time, right? After which there ensued a period of abandonment lasting up to 300 years. So you see what's going on? And it just talks about indeed there was destruction. So indeed in the city, they seen a violent, fiery destruction. Remember all those fires talking about there? Fiery destruction, traces of which were 1177 BC, collapse of civilization and rise of ancient Israelites and Philistia. So you can see what's going on there, right? And it shows you those places, right? So Hazar was destroyed, Megiddo and other places, Dor, a couple different places would have been affected, and a lot of sieges that would have happened there. But it goes on, it talks about the remains at Megiddo, Israel, which dates to late Bronze Age 3 and late Iron Age 2, respectively. So it lets you know that indeed they show those destruction layers, just to kind of make that understood, that they're basically saying indeed it has those destruction layers there in these cities, just like the scripture says. So you can see they'll talk about basically there's indeed evidence of it being destroyed, right? So it was a lot of places being destroyed in this time frame. So Joshua and the other writers was taking off the dating of Hazor destruction in Joshua 11. One more place, ancient Hazor, right? They just talk about what happened there and everything. It obviously had some things going on and everything. But notice what it says right here, documented the great, pretty much total destruction of the final late Bronze Age city, right? So it's believed to happen about 1233 BC. So things happening in 1230, around that time, right? And this city was basically totally destroyed in a conquest, right? So we're seeing evidence of a conquest that's taken off in the area of the Levant and everything. So this just talk about some of those things. Just close that. Some of the destruction that happens there. So he's almost at the bottom, almost there, right? So extra interesting. I think this was kind of interesting because the Fourth Crusade, I thought it was interesting how the Fourth Crusade kind of has a mirror to the conquest of Joshua. Now, the reason why I say that is because look at what it says in this part of the Fourth Crusade. Now, obviously, the Fourth Crusade is way later after the time of Joshua, but notice something that is said in the destruction during the Fourth Crusade. That's kind of interesting on this one. But it goes on and talks about during the Fourth Crusade and everything, Constantinople was moving around and everything and was making some movements and whatnot. But let me actually point out right here this interesting thing about Constantinople. Now remember when I say this, the Crusaders, they was trying to get Jerusalem, right? Think about this. They was going to go and destroy Jerusalem so they can take Jerusalem from the Muslims. But they end up attacking Constantinople. The Crusaders end up attacking their own capital, the groups that were paying them, and they end up taking the main capital but leaving. So it says Constantinople to collect basically a sum of money, because they needed basically a sum of money that they didn't get, that they were promised. They attacked the city. The city was sacked in 1204, and its riches, it's look, it's in 12, it's like 12 BC to 1280, right? Kind of interesting how that all lines up like that. But I thought this was interesting because this was the headquarters of those groups, Constantinople. When the Israelites came out, their headquarters is going to be Jerusalem. And I need to show you one more destruction evidence, and it has to do with one more layer, right? In fact, the Christian Crusaders attacked one of the headquarters of Rome, right? So watch this. Throughout the Israelite tribes, though the Israelite tribes entered Palestine before the end of the late Bronze Age. So remember that Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. That's when the Israelites pop up. Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. That's going to be exactly when the Israelites come up. Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. All right. So it goes on and says, had events follow their normal course. Just talks about some of the Canaanites and everything and some of the coastal areas. It just says, so it just talks about how they would have basically, if they was organized, they would have pushed away the Israelites. But it says a little bit about the Sea People and Ramses III that had happened also near in that time. That's something that's also important. Let's just talk about the Philistines and the Iron Age. It's just important to note the Philistines will be existing in that time frame, and the Israelites were dealing with them in that time frame after Manasseh, where it talks about both of those groups. So right here, remember Kadesh. Where's Kadesh? Edom, king of Edom. So remember that Kadesh, Edom. It says, but when Israel came up from Egypt, so here's what happened. Judges 11:16. When Israel came up from Egypt and walked throughout the land to the Red Sea and came to Kadesh, where Edom was, then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, let me, I pray you, pass through your land. But the king of Edom would not listen, right? He would not listen. But then he went to Moab and everything. But then Israel stayed in Kadesh, right? Stayed in the border of Edom. So very, very important to note that, because Kadesh, right? We're going to note in this little area what's going to happen here. So Kadesh. So these little areas are going to have some connections, this whole wide area. But it says right here, according to the Bible, the Israelites stayed at a place called Kadesh, following their exodus from Egypt and wandering through the desert. Now, if you're wondering why I'm kind of like going forward, back, because the details, the way that the details was examined, instead of shotgunning all the details at once, it kind of go back to kind of give the reminder of each one, because all these things are intertwined. And then it's going to talk about from there, you're going to know Solomon's going to rise up and going to have his little area in these little areas. But that's going to give us some, what's the word I'm looking for? No doubt ties. There is no doubt ties of the Israelites in those areas. Whatnot. Go a little down. It's almost finished. Here's something from Josephus. Watch what Josephus says. Josephus identifies Miriam's burial, which the Bible identifies as Kadesh, with Petra, which is called Rakim. So Kadesh has ties with Petra, which is a place where Edom was. So that's going to be very important to kind of take note of some certain ties like that when you think of Kadesh, this little area here. And remember, that's going to no doubt be in the area where the Israelites were. So they left out of the wilderness. The land of Edom will be right in these little areas here. So that's going to be very important. Kadesh, right in the corner there. So that's going to be very important. that the Israelites will be right in the corner of that lower area, just like the scriptures say. So the land of Kadesh just talks about also who else is in that, or Karak. The land of Karak also has another king. It's a home of the kingdom of Moab. So during the first millennium BC, so you see all these nations all established around there. And then you see that he would have their own idols there, an idol and a city and a couple of different things that would be there in these areas. So here's another place where the Moabites would be. So right in this little area. So that's going to be something to kind of note of, that there's no doubt of these groups, that they will be existed there. But Iron Age is we're going to be in an Iron Age. The Iron Age is now what we're looking at now. So very important. But first, let me read a few things here. Remember, it wasn't Joshua who took Jerusalem, but David later on. So that's why we was leading on to Jerusalem, because when Jerusalem is taken, that's when the Israelites really become a stable kingdom, right? So Scripture records, even though that's structure too. Scripture records Joshua never managed to take Jerusalem, right? Or Jabes, as it was called, right? So Jerusalem, as it was called, Jabes, or the Jebusites, right? The Jebusites resisted Israelite occupation. So remember who was at Jerusalem first? The Jebusites, right? The two people did coexist with the Israelites settlement, likely outside the city walls in the surrounding hill and valley. So Joshua 1:21 describes such scenario in ancient Jerusalem. It says, and the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwelt with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Now, listen to what it said there. Didn't Judges say that Israel didn't drive out the inhabitants of Jerusalem? What does that mean? That means that the inhabitants of Jerusalem were Canaanites for a long time. That's important to understand. They didn't drive them out yet until later on with David. So remember that Joshua did not drive out the inhabitants of Jerusalem, but he did take out like the king and stuff of that, the ruler. We're gonna look at that. It says early Iron Age Jerusalem, so you can note this, right? 12 BC to 900 BC. The events of late Bronze Age above took place in ancient Jerusalem between Jerusalem, Melchizedek, right, mentioned by these individuals. I'm just gonna skip this part. This is just some things that we need to understand. That Jerusalem, the Jebusites might have been Amorites, right? So it's just important to understand that the Jebusites might have been Amorites. So that's important to know for those Canaanites there. But as it says in Joshua 10:23, and they did so and brought forth those 5 kings to him out of the cave, the king of Jerusalem, right? So remember, they took the king, but they didn't take the area. So the king of Jerusalem, Haran, and other ones, Lachish and other ones around. So that's very important, that Jerusalem had basically strangers there for a while, right? Ancient Jerusalem appears frequently in documents discovered from the late Bronze Age. The most famous of these documents is in the Amarna letters, written from Vessel King, Canaanite city-states, to the Pharaoh of Egypt, right? The Amarna letters mostly date from the first half of the 4th century BC, so 1399 to 13 BC. So we know that at that time, who was still there? The Jebusites. So if the Amarna letters was telling us that Joshua did not invade and take the area of Jerusalem, that means Jerusalem still had those Jebusites still there until the time of David. So very important. But it talks about, it lets us know that the tablets were basically that were going from the Amarna layers was written in Akkadian and everything. Here it goes on a little bit. By 12 BC, major historical evidence contests that the Israelites was in the land of Israel, right? Returning and establishing themselves in the Iron Age, right? Lower areas of the Fertile Crescent, right? Typical Canaanite cities included temples to their foreign gods, a stone stepped structure, 59 feet high and 42 and a half feet wide, was discovered in ancient Jerusalem. So you see they found some idols there in ancient Jerusalem. This structure dates back to 12 BC and was part of the Jebusite city David conquered. So you see what's going on there? So they found a giant structure that was not part of the Israelite kingdom. The most likely place where Jerusalem's public building and important monuments were located is under the Temple Mount, which for obvious reasons cannot be excavated. So the amount of just the few evidence that we can find for these things is great, because then we can find out, what's going on here and whatnot, and why these things are like this. So this just kind of talk about the invasion and everything on this one and everything. But they did find some very interesting finds there that kind of bring some things together. But here's a little idea of the city of David. Now, there's some important things to know about the city of David. The city of David most likely was the real Jerusalem. So the ancient Jerusalem was there. And then all of a sudden later on, it will be expanded. The territory will be expanded later on by Solomon. But the city of David, which is in the city of David, was the area that David was at, that he took, Zion. All right. The city of David basically have the real Jerusalem. Very important. All right. So the old city, the city of David, very important. For most of its history, Jerusalem was not located within the boundaries of the present day old city, but to the south of it, on the small eastern hill, now again called the city of David. That's important to know where the real Jerusalem is at, in the city of David, right? King David himself would surely not recognize it, because in his day, the land basically looked different, right? So very important with some of those things. I want to just talk about some of the structures of the land and whatnot. So David would be the one that actually would take the area. So the town was actually inhabited by Jebusites, right? Until basically David takes it, right? Long story short. But they did find evidence, right? They did find evidence basically Canaanites were living there. And then afterwards, they're going to find evidence that it was replaced. Let's talk a little bit about that for the last thing. All right. What's happening here? All right. Let me make sure I point this out on the bottom. All right. Several public structures from the 10th and 9th century BC have been found, right? So let's talk about like that stepped stone structure that we was just talking about, the commonly stepped stone structure that they found. And they found that to be what? Elements of it were already discovered by these certain individuals who called it the Jebusite ramp. So they called it the Jebusite ramp in the lands of Jerusalem, the Jebusite ramp. Other parts have been found by pretty much other individuals and everything. So they know that indeed it has some of these evidences of other individuals being there right before Israelites get there, right? So it just talks about indeed it's going to have some evidences of these things. It says it must have had a defensive function. Linked with this structure is a casemate well, of which a very small part has been discovered on top of the hill. This wall ran north. Building elements normally used for public buildings were found. Right, building elements normally used for public buildings were found, such as a large number of fine, right, just different ones discovered in destruction debris near the step stone structure. So it's very important. So it's going to talk about basically what happens with these cities and everything, and that they know that it's possible that they had some idols like statues of Baal there, and a couple of different things that were there, or like maybe a temple for Baal that was there. There was no doubt that Jerusalem. So think about that. If the Israelites, their main capital was Jerusalem, and we have evidence that at first the Israelites weren't there, then all of a sudden the city is going to be taken. That's one of the biggest evidences of the change of the Israelite kingdom, how the Israelite kingdom started to develop from being an ancient Canaanite lands there to a new transformed kingdom, right? Even though at some points the Israelites kept going back into idolatry. But Megiddo, Hazor, Gezer, Lachish were all small towns showing the same characteristics, right? They had the same stuff going on. They was all Jebusite cities, but then they were taken. So these cities will be taken and then develop Jerusalem. It says large fortifications, right? Some of the different monastery things, public buildings, and hardly any ordinary houses. So that's very important. Hardly any ordinary houses, because it's going to be a city that's going to be built like for kings. So that's important. That's why it says, based on archaeological record alone, one could remarkably assume that these were the seats of the governments of several small regional states that only later fused into the historically attested states of Israel and Judah. So now it's telling you how the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were developed. So we had to go through that whole process in order to understand that, where Israel and Judah started to come from and everything. So a little bit on that. All right. And this one, I'm not going to play. This is just a little video that it just has some interesting things for a playlist. This is just a playlist stuff. I thought that was a great, one of the best breakdowns of the Exodus and whatnot. But that's something that I think is important. This is just some other evidences of things that were at Jerusalem. Research finds Iron Age ivory plaques in the ancient Jerusalem mansions. So they found mansions with beautiful designs and stuff in the temple. So the first temple era, they found expensive ivory that was there. So that was something that they know that indeed it was a temple. It was in fact very rich, had a lot of money and everything. So he said it was typical to Judah and everything, whatnot. So we know the Israelites did settle in these areas. There's no doubt that the Israelites will be a group that settled in this area. So dating the birth of Israel. So was it 15 or 12 BC? They'll say, right? 12 or 15 BC for those things. But from what we're seeing, some of these evidences, and from the rise of the Hyksos invasions and stuff, until the conquest of these areas, I'm thinking more so that there's no doubt that in the Bronze Age, these Israelite groups would have settled there. So this just gives us more like harmony of those sources that we was talking about. This is a nice one because it puts like a lot of them together, a lot of the pieces that we were just talking about together, and just puts it into a little summary. So that's nice to look at. So I just put that there as an extra. And I'll leave it like that. So something just came out basically a few days ago. And it's basically up to the destruction of where the Assyrians come there. So the Israelites come there, and they're going to be later on, when they're destroyed, is by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So this one, I'm going to leave alone for another day, and we'll touch again on this live study on the Iron Age. We'll continue in the Iron Age. So today was just a transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, right? So since we're mostly providing the evidence of it, we're not gonna. I had some things I wanted to go into, like the genetics stuff, but we'll say that for another time. But we'll just note this video that we did do this, that we took our time and plotted all the genetic information so that we have the evidence of these things. So now I'm gonna summarize what we just touched on today. So what we just touched on today was basically the historicity and the evidence that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob existed. That Abraham and Isaac and Jacob existed. The structure of the landscaping makes sense. The name of individual cultures of that land, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Ishmaelites, right? Midianites, those will all be from Abraham, and they all pop up in the Bronze Age. And they all speak west Semitic, Northwest Semitic. So that's very important. With Arameans, those are also going to be ties of Abraham's family lines. They're going to all exist right in the Bronze Age, rise in the Bronze Age. They're also going to have culture ties with the Amorites. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're going to have ties to Canaan and to Israel, ties to all these cultures that we just talked about today. The destruction at Sodom and Gomorrah, seems there's a lot of evidence for that. There's a lot of evidences for basically the harmonious understanding of the biblical narrative. So what I would say with that, may we understand that the biblical narrative is like a biography of God and the people around him, and that we ourselves should look into the Bible and take the Bible as a very real and serious source, I would say. But with that, family, if you have any questions before I go, let me know. That was a quick historical summary of the evidence of Israel and basically how we know Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all of his family are real, and that we're basically reading a very, very, very serious and realistic book that holds value in the real world. So that's something that we definitely can know about. So we went from basically the fall of to the understanding of the Levant till the Iron Age. So we went from 2000 to 1000 BC. So that's about what we did today. 2000 BC to 1000 BC. So about 1,000-year stretch. And that will be the rise of the Israelite nation. So not major genetics today, but I'll put some meat in the description as we have some other things we might go into another time. But with that, that's all I got for now. With that, family, may you be blessed, may you be beloved, and amen, family.